That's actually Phil Bentley's wife. She's her chief of staff.
Are you serious?
Sweet, you're probably to
I've
not
never met her. They have a young child. She used to work in legislative council.
Very good.
other than that.
She's still alive.
Well, no offense to
I would have offered to give you a ride, but I stayed down here last night, so besides, I guess you were here before.
Here fairly early, but I enjoyed it.
You enjoy the food?
Well, not the commute's terrible, as you know.
Yes, it's got to be bad.
Punch this thing when you talk.
What's that?
You have to press this thing when you talk.
I think you press it to mute. It's just on.
Good morning, Kate.
Good morning, Mr. Treasurer. How are you?
Well, good morning, Gina.
Last time I saw you,
That's right. That's right.
Land Board will come to order. Mary?
Good morning, Governor, Treasurer, and Secretary. We have a couple of brief items on the agenda before we turn to the bulk of the meeting. The first is just to approve the minutes from both the special meeting that we held in Coos Bay on October 8th, as well as our regular meeting on October 14th. Staff recommends approval of the minutes.
Governor, I would move approval of the minutes for the October 8th special meeting in Coos Bay and the October 14th regular meeting.
I second. And Mary, could you check your mic? I'm not sure it's on. Is it
I
on?
think
Okay,
it's on.
good.
Yeah.
All right, good.
I'll just try and speak louder, sorry.
Thank you.
It's been moved and seconded that the Land Board approve the minutes of the October 8th special meeting in Coos Bay as well as the October 14th regular meeting. Is there discussion? Without objection, so ordered.
So following that, we have two brief informational items. And the first one, I'll invite Director Doug Decker and Liz Dent from the Oregon Department of Forestry to come up and give the annual report on the lands that they manage for the department.
Welcome.
Good morning. Governor Kitzauer, Treasurer Wheeler, Secretary Brown. For the record, I'm Doug Decker, Oregon State Forester, Director of the Department of Forestry. I'm joined this morning by Liz Dent, Chief of our State Forest Division. We speak up. Okay, is this on? Stand a little closer. We have an audio issue. Okay.
She nobody ever believes me.
I will use my outside voice. Is that better? Is that working better? Good morning. No, push the button. Okay, push the button. Very good. Okay, so thank you for taking a moment this morning. We're glad to be with you. We're going to be providing an annual report on management of the 117,000 acres of common school forest lands, which includes the 86,000 acre Elliott State Forest and the common school forest land in 18 other counties. As you know, the Department of Forestry manages these lands in response to your policy direction and the objectives that are described in statute and constitution and through the agreement that we have that ODF has with DSL. In a minute, Liz is going to walk you through the key aspects of the 2014 annual report. But before she does, I first want to just acknowledge the uncertainty regarding the future of the Elliott and the sizable task before you, as the State Land Board and DSL, in defining that future. Our team here in Salem and in Coos Bay has worked hard and in good faith to meet the financial performance requirements that come along with common school assets and also striving to meet the threatened endangered species protections as well. And as you'll hear and as you know, these conflicting directions and constraints, they inform the results in this annual report that you're going to hear in a minute, just as they set the table for this morning's discussion about the alternatives project. From a historical perspective, for the last 70 years, generations of our employees have made investments in the Elliott. They've acquired parcels that have added to its size and its diversity. They've protected it from insects, disease, and fire. They've improved fish habitat, improved road systems, and these employees know these lands. And today, we also know that you are on the cusp of charting a new direction. As you move forward in these discussions about the future, I would like for ODF to be part of the solution, bringing our knowledge about this landscape into the equation. It may very well be under a different paradigm or with a different set of objectives and desired outcomes, but given our past ties to these lands, which are named for Oregon's very first state forester, and our desire to find workable and sustainable solutions for Oregon's forests, we're ready to help in that conversation. I think Liz is going to walk us through the 2014 annual report.
All right, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today. I know that you have a lot to do, so I'm going to keep my comments extremely brief, especially because all the information that I'm hitting on today, and I'll just obviously hit on just a small portion, is in the annual report that's a part of your package. The annual report format follows this sort of high elevation, less detailed information in this outside sleeve, and the inside portion has the more detailed and more extensive information in a series of tables and graphs. So, as you are aware, our mandate for the Land Board is to manage these lands to secure the greatest benefit for the people of this state, consistent with the conservation of the resource under sound techniques of land management. The way this plays out in our management activities on the Elliott and other DSL lands is to manage the forest with a working forest framework. At the same time, protecting and enhancing habitat for fish and wildlife, protecting soil and water quality resources as well. The purpose of the annual report is to summarize the harvest activities and the associated revenue that comes from those harvest activities, as well as the other benefits that flow from managing these forests. So in my conversation this morning, I'll start with touching on the economic benefits that occurred over the 2014 reporting season, and then I'll briefly describe the social benefits associated with our activities, and then provide just some key points from the ecological benefits. So first of all, from the economic perspective, on common school forest land, ODF harvested 11 million board feet. 7 million board feet of that came from the Elliott State Forest activities. This produced a revenue of approximately $3.6 million, and the total cost associated with managing these lands was $3.7 million. Fire protection costs were about $380,000. As you're aware, DSL uses net operating income as a key performance measure to evaluate how things are going in the management of these forests. By this measure, we have admittedly seen a downward trend since 2010. This is true even though the stumpage prices have been trending up as the timber market has improved over recent years. The negative trend in the net operating income performance measure largely reflects significant policy changes that were made in 2013 to ensure that forest management activities are compliant with the Endangered Species Act for marbled murrelets. Currently, this policy, combined with an increasing occurrence of marbled murrelet habitat, has the greatest operational impact on our management of the Elliott State Forests. This situation has limited the number of timber sales that we've been able to offer. Clearly, you're working on this topic later today, so I won't go into any more detail at this time on that topic. While the net operating income was a negative $174,000, this was a slight improvement over the 2013 net operating income performance measure, and this is due to the deep reductions in our Elliott State Forest workforce. We made those reductions in an attempt to change that pattern that we were observing. Several social benefits, so switching topics from the strictly economic benefits. There are several social benefits that are linked with harvest on these lands. Importantly, the revenue helps to support schools and local communities, and clearly that's a really important driver around your decision-making processes that drive the policies. In addition, the timber harvest that takes place generates important forest sector jobs. One estimate is that timber harvest associated with 11 million board feet creates approximately 122 timber harvest-related jobs. So moving from the social benefits to a look at ecological benefits, the ecological benefits are largely a result of the investment that we've been making back to the land and into watersheds. And this investment it represents improvements to the resource conditions, and those improvements are clearly taking place today and certainly will play out in the future. So some examples of this, and this is largely reported on the back page of the outer leaflet. The examples of this sorts of investment include stream enhancement projects, protecting habitat for endangered species, reductions in Swiss needlecast, improved road conditions, and fish passage. So over the last 2 decades on the Elliott State Forest, we've, under the direction of Department of State Lands, have implemented 55 stream enhancement projects, 101 road improvement projects, 30 fish passage improvement projects, and we're protecting 26 spotted owl sites and 71 marble murrelet areas. So in summary, we recognize that this is an important time of change for the Land Board and Department of State Lands. And just as always, the Department of Forestry will continue to work closely with DSL to help provide the leadership and support that's needed to help shape the future of forest management on common school forest lands. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions?
No, thank you.
Thank you, Rashid.
So for the next informational item, it's the annual report from our land management activities, and I'd ask Assistant Director Jim Paul to come up and give the presentation.
Thank you, Mary. Good morning, Governor Kitzhaber.
Morning.
Treasurer Wheeler.
Morning.
Secretary Brown. Happy to be with you this morning. As Mary said, I'm going to give a very brief presentation on a summary of our annual report for fiscal year 2014 on our real property activities. This report summarizes all of our revenue activities and outcomes on the 2.8 million acres of both trust and statutory lands that are managed by DSL to generate revenues for the Common School Fund. That's made up of about 750,000 acres of trust lands, another 750,000 acres of subsurface only trust lands, and another 1.3 million acres of statutory lands, which are navigable waters, territorial seas, and tidally influenced lands. Overall, it was actually a very good year in many respects for our real property work, notwithstanding the situation we're facing with the Elliott. And I'll just give you a few highlights here. Our net revenues have increased in all categories of lands this past year, with the exception of our agricultural lands. That was primarily due to a lessee that went bankrupt. It was a very significant lease that we had on those lands that we are now in the effort working on trying to get under lease again. Otherwise, if you look specifically at our other trust lands, not including the picture with our forest lands, we've doubled our net revenues in the last 2 years, from a little under $500,000 to close to $1 million. Even with our forest lands, we have actually seen a $2.2 million improvement due to the work of ODF to really look hard at how we're managing those lands in spite of the issues we're dealing with. And then on our statutory lands, we had over 100% increase in net revenues, from about $900,000 to over $1.8 million. And finally, our land sale revenues, we probably hit a high, if not close to a high year, with $4.3 million in revenues. And those revenues go into a sub-account of the Common School Fund, which is currently above $11 million that we have accumulated from our land sale program. And those $11+ million generated over $2 million in interest that added to the fund from those activities. Just a few more points to wrap up to talk about the future. We are going to continue with multiple efforts towards actively managing our real property portfolio to try to continue this performance. We are looking at potential agricultural development opportunities on about 3,800 acres of unleased rangelands that have the potential, we believe. We've already completed 2 projects in the last few years, and we hope to continue that work. We have another 3,600 acres of unleased rangelands that we're going to actively pursue, trying to get under lease. And we are also continuing to evaluate our lands that are non-productive or minimally productive for divestment. Since about 2006, when we really started down this strategy with the REAMP, passed at that time our annual, our real estate annual or management plan. We've sold about 5,300 acres. Currently, we're looking at least another 5,500 acres that we potentially may divest of because of minimal or low performance, which makes up about 80 parcels we have in the queue right now for potential sale that we are working on. Two final points. We're also looking at our expenditures side. We've had a couple really bad years in terms of fire expenditures on rangelands. We are going to actively look at different ways we might be able to approach how we protect our rangelands for fire to reduce those costs. And finally, we are continuing to look at the potential for alternative energy development on our trust lands, including solar, geothermal, and potentially wind. And with that, I'll stop and be happy to answer any questions if you have some.
Questions from the landlord? Thank you very much.
Okay, I think what we'll do now is turn to the principal topic at hand today, which is the report out on the Elliott State Forest Alternatives Project. And I'd like to ask John Potter, who's been leading that effort, to join me here at the table. I'm going to walk through a very high-level overview of the project and the results that we have come up with. You'll find all the information in two reports in your binders, the technical report produced by Evergreen Economics, as well as the department's report, which really is designed to set the context for the technical report for some of the other considerations that need to be thought through from you on deciding how we approach the future of the Elliott State Forest. So I just want to start by reminding everyone that this is a really tough issue. This is not a simple, straightforward issue. We're talking about, with the Elliott State Forest and all our constitutional lands, we're talking about lands that do not have a general public lands mandate, as we see with other lands that the state may own. These lands have a very specific mandate. They were given to us at statehood for the benefit of schools, and so their management mandate is quite restricted. It does provide both timber revenues, the Elliott, as well as other non-market values, and it's really trying to find the balance of how to make sure we meet the trust mandate as well as protect whatever we can from the other non-market values. We've worked on this problem for over 7 months, not counting all the years before now that this problem has been addressed. But over the last 7 months, we've worked gathering public input as well as technical information to try and pull together the information that you could use to consider what you want, how you want us to proceed forward and give us direction. We've produced the two reports that you see in front of you, as well as 4 possible transition scenarios for the management of the forest. And that's what I'm going to spend the bulk of my time talking about. I want to note, though, before I get started, that these are not siloed scenarios, if you will. There are components of each of the scenarios that could be mixed with some of the components from the other scenarios. And so I encourage you to just keep an open view of all the possibilities that are laid out in these 4 scenarios. So the first 2 scenarios really have to do with the Common School Fund retaining ownership of the Elliott State Forest. There are some advantages to that approach. You would retain the asset value of the forest. So there are a number of markets that are fairly immature at this point in time that may over time increase the value of the forest, and you would still have the forest to invest in those and get revenue from those opportunities potentially in the future. So you retain your asset value. The other is that we have, as the department and through the State Land Board, invested a lot of resources in the Elliott. And by retaining ownership, you continue to use those resources that have already been invested. And the Department of Forestry just laid out several nice lists of the kinds of things that they have done working and managing the forest for us. Very basically, the decision to maintain ownership is a decision that's reversible. So you don't have, it's not a one-way street, if you will. You could work at retaining ownership and try some of the scenarios that we've laid out. And then if they did not work, you could always reconsider and go back to the possibilities of transferring ownership. And finally, Continuing to own the forest guarantees that there would be at least some timber production and public access to the local communities and interested people around the state. And that's something we heard very loud and clear was of concern from the community. There are some risks, however. The most important one from our perspective as a department in representing you as the board is that as long as you own this forest, there's a potential for continued litigation. So we have out on the forest a number of protected species that we help provide habitat for, and the fact that they are there will continue to be an opportunity if someone wants to challenge our management, whatever that might be. The other risk that's very important to remember is that if we're going to be producing more than a zero net revenue, we are at some point in time going to have to harvest older trees. And it is, in fact, the harvest of older trees that has been so contentious in the past.
Could you please define older trees as you're describing?
I would say that over 100, potentially perhaps up to 125-year-old trees. So big trees.
Thank you.
Governor?
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit more about what that means in terms of amount, percentage, et cetera?
Well, currently we have right around 40% of the forest is over 80 years old. And so when you start, because of the sort of dendritic pattern across the Elliott, you're likely to run into, anywhere you go to harvest, with very few exceptions, you're likely to run into some of those older trees. And with very good reason, people are concerned about cutting down trees of that age. So those are sort of the general advantages and risks that are faced if you continue to own the Elliott. I want to talk a little bit about the two scenarios that we've put forward under this category. The first would be one that would solicit management proposals from interested parties. And this option would allow you, with work from the department, to set up and define the outcomes that you want for the forest, and then look for some entity to manage it to reach those outcomes. And this could be any interested party. It could be a private individual. It could be a consortium of people. It could be the Department of Forestry. It could be any person or entity that was interested and had the skills and could meet the outcomes that you laid forward for the forest. The advantage of this is that you, in fact, do get to control what the outcomes look like. So you would be able to establish the outcomes that you wanted. The risks, and these are more just cautions rather than risks that I want to make sure you understand. In the Evergreen Economics Report, this option is modeled for a number of parameters. However, when we modeled it, we had one proposal in front of us that would have just picked up basically the 2011 Forest Management Plan that you all had adopted. We doubt seriously that we would be able to go immediately back to that level of harvest without a risk of litigation. And so what you see in that report should be considered a very high end, and you should expect to see probably a substantially lower harvest level. So I wanted to make sure you understood that. There also has been some interest about the liability for the board if the management was turned over to someone else. And so we've worked with the Department of Justice, and we understand that there may be some very limited decrease in liability, but as owners of the property, you would still be liable under the litigation that might be directed towards management of the forest. The second scenario that we lay out, and please feel free to stop me at any time if there are questions about these particular scenarios. I'm just trying to get the overview taken care of so that we can move to allow people to speak as well.
Well, let me just clarify one thing.
Okay.
On the first option, you pointed out, and I think what I heard you say, and I think I agree with it, that if you were to have some other entity, so the state retains ownership of the land and some other entity manages it within constraints that we build in on the front end, the issues around endangered species and marbled millet, et cetera, don't go away. They're still there, and so those constraints are going to be going to exist for whoever is managing the forest.
That's correct, Governor. And that goes back to the risks I laid out in general. As long as you own this land, there is a risk of continued litigation. So,
Well, isn't there a risk of continued litigation no matter who owns the land, because the environmental
There is,
laws
but
apply to
there is
across the
but,
landscape, right?
There is, Governor. Of course, I am most interested as the representative of the department in the risks that are that you are exposed to.
Okay. Governor, may I ask a question?
Yes,
So we don't get out from under the liability. Do we get out from under the trust obligations under scenario 1?
No, you do not.
Thank you.
Okay.
I guess I should check with my counsel to make sure that's the correct answer. Yes. Okay. So let me go on to scenario number 2. This scenario is somewhat a continuation of the current situation. So as you know, we have been working for a number of years, 12 or 13, to try and get a habitat conservation plan with an incidental take permit from the federal services that are charged with protecting the 3 listed species we have out on the Elliott. And the 3 species are the marbled murrelet, the northern spotted owl, which are protected by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And really, the marbled murrelet has been the source of most of the litigation we've had. We also have coastal coho that use the watersheds along within the Elliott, and that species is protected by the National Marine Fisheries Service under NOAA's the NOAA administration. So what's interesting is that the habitat conservation issue that we're faced with actually doesn't have really anything to do with what has caused all the litigation, which is the protected bird species. The complications we've had with the habitat conservation plan are around the protections for the coastal coho. And I would note, and I think it's important for everyone to understand, that this, for us, has always been a little bit of a dilemma because the Elliott State Forest is really it's less than 2% of the coastal watersheds in Oregon, and yet it produces over 20% of the coastal coho spawners. And that's with the current management. That's over the last, it took the last 10 years. And so we're not talking about, anything that's more additional protections with what we've been doing already. We've been a major producer of coastal coho spawners, and yet it's been very difficult to come to agreement with NOAA Fisheries around that issue. I do want to note that over the last year, we've engaged very tightly with NOAA Fisheries trying to come up with a solution to this dilemma. And they have worked extremely hard with the staff from the Department of Forestry and the Department of State Lands to try and find a balance. We got closer, there's no question, and we've tried some pretty creative, innovative approaches, but we're still not there. We still haven't come to a place where we think that we can get a habitat conservation plan that would both meet the protection levels for the coastal coho that NOAA Fisheries is charged with implementing, as well as the trust obligations for you as the State Land Board. There is no guarantee that we would ever get there, so we'll come back to that when we talk about risks. Because of that, if the board is interested in this scenario, we would recommend strongly as a department that there be a time certain on the efforts to try and get to a habitat conservation plan. And if we were unable to reach that by the time frame set out by the board, that we would then go back to evaluating other possibilities, including divesting of the asset. So there are some advantages to the habitat conservation plan. It's not all bad news. It is, in fact, a habitat conservation plan with an incidental take permit is, in fact, the best legal coverage you're going to get. It is not 100%. We did have a habitat conservation plan for the northern spotted owl, and in 2005, the services were sued. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was sued by some of the same litigants that have taken us to court. So we know that it's not perfect because those kind of suits can enjoin timber sales, which would, again, decrease the revenues. But it is the best that you can get in terms of legal coverage if you're going to continue to own the forest. Some of the other thing that it does is that it builds on existing efforts. So as I've noted, we've spent a lot of time trying to build a habitat conservation plan, invested a lot of hours and effort, and I think done some very good work. At the end of the day, we're still not there now, but we really have. So you would be able to use the efforts that have already been put forward. The risks, of course, are that you might not find a balance that would work for both the NOAA Fisheries and for yourselves. The other is, as I pointed out earlier, just because you have a habitat conservation plan doesn't mean you have the ability to implement it, because you could have a lawsuit, and that could slow down the implementation. So that's what I had to say about the two scenarios that really would retain ownership for the Common School Fund.
Governor, could I ask
Yes,
a question, please, about the second scenario?
Okay.
What sort of yields are you anticipating under a successful resolution of number 2?
What we have been discussing with the NOAA Fisheries folks is that I need to get somewhere around 25 million board feet of harvest every year from the Elliott, in order to give a return on an investment that would be acceptable for the trust responsibility. And we are, we're arguably within about 5 million board feet of that, but trying to get that last 5 million board feet has proven to be very difficult.
And how, if I may, Governor, one
Yes,
other
please.
question. How are you determining within our obligations around the trust responsibility? What threshold are you using as an acceptable threshold?
Well, we certainly want to not have the revenues be in the red anymore. So that was our first threshold. And then talking with council, it's obvious that a zero revenue is really not probably the what you want to meet either. So what we've been looking at is somewhere between 1% and 3% return on investment.
Governor, may I ask another question? Maybe this is a question for legal counsel, but is operating out of the red, does that constitute meeting our fiduciary obligations?
The question would be whether or not it's the plan that provides the long-term economic gain for the Common School Fund. And if the plan is looking at the long-term economic return and focused on how best to achieve that return of the asset, that would be the trust obligations.
Let me ask the question a different way. So the 1992 Attorney General's opinion, based on the Admissions Act and interpretation of the state constitution, was that our obligation is to maximize revenues for the Common School Fund. And so I guess my question is, getting it out of the red, does that constitute maximizing our revenues under our trust obligation?
If I may, counsel. Obviously, as I noted, the first step was to get us out of the red. We don't believe that's sufficient, and that's why we tried to look at, well, what is a reasonable harvest return on investment that we would find acceptable. That is really a choice for you as the board, and if 1% to 3% is not acceptable, then that is something that we would need to hear.
And I'm sorry, one
no,
more
no.
question, then I promise I'll stop.
No,
It's
no,
an
you
interesting
won't.
point for me, maybe nobody else.
Yeah.
But once we negotiate an HCP, we're locked in to a certain yield, aren't we? So you say it's a first step, but we're locked in.
We are, but I would remind you, Treasurer, that the goal here is really the long-term revenue off of the forest. And so if we're locked in, but we don't have litigation, presuming that we don't have litigation that we have to fight, we have lower costs, and we have probably, depending on the term of the HCP, probably 30 to 50 years that we are able to manage the forest. During that time, there may be some shifts in some of these other revenue opportunities that the board would then be able to take advantage of.
Okay, well,
so it's looking over the long term as opposed to the...
Fair enough. I would just worry,
Yep.
and I don't know the answer. I'm just expressing a cautionary note that it's not an absolute standard.
That's
It's not
correct.
what's acceptable to us. It's a relative standard relative to other options that could potentially return more. So I personally, I want to be very cautious about setting an absolute standard and locking us into it.
Okay.
So just go ahead, please. No, go ahead, ma'am.
Mary, my question actually is from a fairly different perspective. In terms of the other scenarios, number 2, the HCP, would you put it as more protective of the endangered species on the forest or less protective?
Well, we as the department have been trying to manage it with full protections under the Endangered Species Act, and that's been challenged. We've changed our policies, and we believe that we're doing have taken an even more conservative approach at this point in time. However, using what we have been using, which is a take avoidance approach, we are not getting above zero. And so the HCP would provide protections and at the same time would allow us to harvest. So It's a little difficult for me to say whether it's more or less protective, but it would use the tools that are within the Federal Endangered Species Act to allow incidental take of the species while we perform our management obligations.
Governor, if I may ask a follow-up, and you mentioned earlier that under a number of the scenarios, it's very likely that in order to be financially productive over the long term, that we would need to harvest trees that are in the neighborhood of 100 years old. Under an HCP, is that more likely to occur, less likely to occur?
Our estimate, just looking at operationally across the forest at timber harvest, is that under any scenario where we continue to own the forest and harvest at a rate that would get us above zero, so a positive net revenue, will entail having to cut some trees, some older trees.
So just one question on the I guess Ted said, the treasurer said, is operating out of the red enough to meet your long-term obligations? If in fact, and I don't know that this is the case, but if in fact the interpretation and application of federal environmental laws precludes you from a harvest level that does anything but give you a little bit out of the red, does that meet your long-term fiduciary obligations? I guess I'm asking council that.
If it's a current resource that the state, the land board is managing, the obligation is to manage it in a way that produces income to the maximum extent possible. And if in managing you're bound by the federal laws, you're bound by the Endangered Species Act, so you can't look at what income could be possible in a world void of those regulations. They have to be taken into account.
Right. So obviously the Emissions Act and the standard of maximizing revenue were obviously put in place before these subsequent laws were passed.
That's correct.
Okay.
Right. Okay. So that's if we keep the ownership of the Elliott within the Common School Fund. So let's move now to the two scenarios that we put forward for transferring the ownership. And I want to be clear about a couple of things. The transfer of ownership from the Elliott could go to a variety of players, and what we've laid out are two that would at least include some portion of a public entity. But it wouldn't have to be 100% public ownership, nor would it have to be, over 50%, but just some potential for public involvement in the ownership as it transferred out of the Common School Fund. And those public entities could range from local to state to federal. So the idea of the two scenarios 3 and 4, that would transfer the ownership is to have the ownership transfer while the Common School Fund is made whole. That is to say, any transfer would have to include a market value price for the Elliott in order for the board to meet its trust mandate. The advantage of this are, again, some of the really basic conversations that we've had over the last 7 months. You would decouple completely school funding from timber harvesting. And that's something that, again, it's sort of like the continued litigation. That's going to continue to be an issue as you try to manage forest for revenue for schools. So you have the opportunity, if you transfer the ownership, to sever that link. It also avoids further reductions in the value of the Elliott State Forest. So we've seen over the past couple of decades, as the implications of the Endangered Species Act have come into play, a decrease in the estimated value of the forest. Now, we don't go out every year and do a full appraisal because that would be cost prohibitive, but just in the estimates that we have done, we've seen a reduction in those estimates. And that certainly played out as we looked at the land sales that we conducted earlier this year. The risks are that the two processes that we put forward for the transfer of ownership are relatively complicated. They're pieces that could take, they're approaches that could take some time to do. There are a couple of possibilities. One is that we might not have anybody who's interested in purchasing the forest, and so we have to be aware that we could do some work and come up with a result that would send us back to the drawing board. And then there's also a possibility of a legal challenge. And this could stem around both the legal issue that we're in court about currently, which has to do with the way the forest was put together in the first place, and some state statutes around that consolidation. Or it could take the form of a question of whether or not you've met your trust mandate in the transfer. And so those are a couple of other legal challenges that are possible with either of these.
And I assume on that option you have the balancing act and the controversy on the front end around conservation easements or whatever the sidebars are going to be in terms of protecting different values.
Right. Governor, it's a really interesting mix of possibilities on how the ownership could transfer. And in fact, some of the revenues that could be generated by private parties are not available to the state. So things like conservation easements, as long as the state owns the property, there's very little interest in groups coming forward and purchasing conservation easements because we already own it. If it's owned by a private consortium or entity, there's a possibility of selling some of those conservation easements for money. And so, again, looking at the third scenario, you really have an opportunity, I'll go into it in detail, to have people propose ways that would transfer the property that would help protect some of those non-market values and still make, because the price still has to be the price, still make the Common School Fund whole.
Governor, may I
Yes,
ask
please.
a question related to that? But if we do transfer from the state land board to another entity, whether it's a state entity or a local entity or some hybrid entity, does our trust obligation go with that new entity, or do we get out from under the trust obligation?
Your trust obligation goes with the monies that you earn that would then be invested as the Common School Fund is invested currently through the Oregon Investment Council.
Very good. Thank you.
So let me talk a little bit in more detail about the third scenario, which is soliciting proposals for a transfer of ownership. And as I was just saying, Governor, to you, the transfer of ownership idea would be to solicit proposals with some sideboards that were set by you all. First and foremost, the one of having to meet the mandate. That could be submitted by any group of people out in the world that wanted to own the Elliott State Forest. The intent, the way we presented this, was to have either a public entity or a public-private consortium make those proposals. And again, we wouldn't presuppose how those looked. We would just let the interested parties submit them.
Governor, may I ask a question, please? So I want to make sure I understood what you just said. So earlier you said that our trust obligation is fulfilled if the value that we get in compensation for a transfer of the assets meets current market value.
Correct.
So there's no obligation to sell it to the highest bidder. Is that correct?
That is a question for council.
The obligation is to achieve full market value. The path that you choose to get there, I believe you would have some discretion on how you get there, whether it's a public auction or a request for proposal, as long as you're able to achieve the fair market value.
Governor, may I ask another question, please? Is it conceivable that we could transfer it to a new state entity? Could the legislature create an entity, we establish the fair market value, and transfer the asset to the new entity at market value without going out to a public auction?
Treasurer Wheeler, that is a possibility. In fact, there's a system like that in Washington State. The trust lands, the state trust lands like the Elliott in Washington State, are held by the Department of Natural Resources. And they actually have a program called the Trust Lands Transfer Program. We spent quite a bit of time talking to them about it. That when lands become encumbered, usually by Endangered Species Act constraints, they have bonding authority, and they're able to buy out the trust value of the land, send the land to another state entity that would manage it for whatever mandate they have, parks or reserve for fish and wildlife, and the trust, the Common School Fund, actually gets the receipt, and they do it at an appraised value.
Okay, so when if I may, Governor, when you're talking about option number 3, you're not talking about privatization. You're still talking about potentially creating a different public entity that isn't under some of the same stringent requirements that the state land board is under. Isn't that what you're really saying?
That's part of it, Treasurer, if I may. It wouldn't even have to be a new entity. It could be state parks, or it could be the Department of Forestry, or it could be ODF&W, the Fish and Wildlife Department. But it could also be a consortium of people who came together, as we've seen in other parts in the U.S., of conservation groups, timber interests, local government,
Like
who
a
came
community
together,
forest
exactly,
model.
like a community forest. So that would also be a possibility. It's possible that some timber interests and conservation groups could come together as a group and decide that they want to invest and protect some of the non-market values with conservation easements on the one hand, and do some timber harvest where possible on the other hand. So we would not presuppose what it looked like. It would require legislation in order for us to set up a similar trust lands transfer program. But I know there's interest in that, and we have been gathering information from the Washington folks on ideas on how to put that forward if that were one of the proposals that were to come forward.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, Kevin.
So I do want to be clear, because it's easy to misread or misinterpret some of the discussion on net present value in the report. And so on page 13 of the Evergreen report, you'll find a chart that shows net present values and some confidence intervals around them for a number of management scenarios. I want to be clear that the net present value is really the value that could be earned solely from timber harvest, because that's the metric that we had to work with, over the next 100 years by whoever owns the forest. So it's not to imply at all that that's how much money you would get if you sold it to a community forest, or you sold it to implemented a trust land transfer. It's to indicate how much money they could make off timber harvests. And again, there may be some other revenues that aren't at this point available to the state that other people could access. Any gap between the market value and the timber earnings that you see on that chart could come from a variety of sources. It could be public financing, it could be private financing, or a combination, which are sort of like a subsidy of that difference between the timber revenues. Or it could be from any other revenue source that people, had presented to us. And again, that's the value of this approach, is it allows people to bring proposals in that would meet some of those requirements.
Governor, may I ask a question, please? I'm sorry to keep interrupting. Under the public auction scenario, and I'm sorry I don't know this, I should. If we put a property to public auction, are foreign companies allowed to bid on those auctions, or do they have to be domestic?
That's a question that I cannot answer for sure. Do you know that, Council?
I don't have the answer.
We would have to look that up and get back to you. I believe that they can, but I don't know that.
I'd be very interested in the answer to that question.
We will look up the answer to that question and get back to you on it. I would submit, however, that a foreign company could have, as is very common in this age of globalization, could easily have a U.S. partner and purchase through the U.S. partner. So I don't know that we eliminate the possibility of a foreign interest buying it if we just restrict it to U.S. And I don't know whether we're allowed to. But we'll look that up and get back to you.
Yes, I'd be interested. Thank you. Thanks, Governor.
So that would be related to, so talk a little bit about an export ban as a
Okay.
condition. So that's where we're dancing around here.
Yeah. So there is a possibility, as you know, when we do sell timber off of state lands, we have a ban on export of the timber that comes off of state lands. We could put that out as one of the outcomes that we would require in the proposals, that there not be export would not be allowed of raw logs. That what you run into every time you put a constraint around what you want is a possibility that you might dampen the enthusiasm of some purchasers, and in this case, some of the consortia. On the other hand, if you can get a consortium together, and this is what we think is of interest, if you can get a consortium together that would be able to, if you will, harvest some of the conservation revenues that are more difficult for us to because we're a public entity, then you could probably have the consortium be willing to give a little on the export ban if they were going to make money someplace else. And so again, that would really be the role of the proposals. But we would be able to set, if not criteria, at least general guidelines, and then we could consider the variety of things that people proposed. Once we set them out as criteria, then you have to be careful because they become more difficult to avoid in terms of the proposals, and it might restrict how the proposals might present their ideas. But if you put it out as general guidelines and are able to consider those as you look overall at all the proposals that come in, that might be a way to approach that issue. We did find, I think you'll recall, when we did the land sales earlier, that the discount that was estimated by the appraiser for implementing an export ban versus not was quite small, and so it really wasn't a big factor at all in the cost, in the value. So let me just give you an overview, given that very good conversation, and forgive me if I repeat a few of the comments that we've already made, but the advantages of this is that it really would allow the proposals to come in from whoever was interested to on how you might transfer the property and still get market value for the Common School Fund. It also, which I think is of quite a bit of interest, because as you'll recall from the meeting that we had in Coos Bay, and you can see from today, there's a considerable amount of interest in the community here in Oregon. Lots and lots of interested Oregonians, and this allows them, it engages them to find a solution, which I think is really valuable. And that includes the local community as well as the conservation and land trust community, timber interests, the legislature, as Treasurer Wheeler pointed out, if they were interested in helping find a solution. It really does allow a broad, it just opens the door for Oregon to figure out how they want to solve the Elliott State Forest problem. The other advantage to this, and we've talked about a few of these already, we heard a lot of options, the Trust Land Transfer Program, the Community Forest Program, that we couldn't really model because we didn't know what they would look like at the end of the day. And this would allow other groups to really set up what they think was possible under something like a community forest approach, and would allow us then to do some analysis and see what it would produce. So we think that it provides a lot of opportunities in that way. The risk is that it's a new way of doing business, and so it is really it's possible that it could take some time, and during that time, unless the board has some other direction over the short term, we would still continue to see pretty low to negative revenues, and so there'd have to be a little bit of patience, if you will, to gain the long-term best interest of the fund. So then I want to talk a little bit just, if there's no more questions about scenario number 3, I want to talk about scenario number 4, which is a direct sale or a land exchange either to a federal entity or to a tribal entity. We sort of picked, the fact that we've called them out in scenario 4, I want to be clear, doesn't prevent them from also being part of the any kind of consortium or interest group for scenarios 1 and 3. So that is to say, if the federal, if the Siuslaw National Forest wanted to put forward a management proposal, they certainly could do that under scenario 1. But because the federal government and the tribes have different requirements under the ESA than other entities, we pulled that out. They also sort of meet the interests that people have had and expressed very strongly about maintaining some public ownership. The advantage of moving to a direct sale or land exchange with either a federal or a tribal entity is really that they're technically the least complicated. That doesn't mean they're the shortest, and I'll come back to that, but they're technically the least complicated. It's a pretty much straight transaction. It also would continue that public ownership that has been, as well as some of the timber production at some level, that's been of such concern for people in the local area in particular, but also across the state. The risks are obvious. The federal government has all sorts of legal, political, and appropriations issues in this day and age, and so you would be, from a federal standpoint, you would be having to work your way through those issues, and it would probably entail a good amount of time. So you'd have a longer period of time before you came to a resolution. In the case of a tribal entity, depending on where the financing came from, if it was federal financing or a federal land exchange in conjunction with a tribal entity, you'd also probably be looking at the same sort of considerations at the federal level because of the ESA requirements of consultation, NEPA analysis for any kind of federal action. So that's sort of the downsides of scenario 4. So I want to summarize so we can turn this over to hear from the public. But I want to give you a few points to think about, and also for the people who are going to speak from the public, just to capture the essence of these, the information in these reports. We understand that none of the scenarios satisfy everyone. And we wish we had one that was a magic bullet, but we don't. But we want to remind you that that's because the Elliott State Forest, like all our common school trust lands, are not owned by the general public. They are, in essence, owned by the schools. And there's a very specific constrained management mandate for those lands. All of the options, the scenarios that we've laid forward, really do require some further due diligence. And so I'd like you to make sure that you understand that there'd be an investment of resources as we move through any due diligence you want us to do around any of these scenarios. And then obviously some work to be done through the implementation as well. As I said at the beginning, these scenarios are not set in stone. They're not carved uniquely different from each other. The opportunity exists to mix and match and to investigate more than one at a time. And in particular, there's an opportunity to investigate a short-term and a long-term approach. And so that's available, and I would encourage you to think about that possibility. And finally, I think it's just really important for all of us to remember that the department has worked hard on this. We've had lots of good input. But at the end of the day, we didn't bring forward any scenario. That is to say, all 4 of these scenarios have the possibility, have the basic mechanism to meet the trust responsibility. So we feel confident that if you provide us direction to to further investigate any of these 4, that we would not be getting down an alleyway that would then have you not meeting your trust mandate. So we have only presented those that we thought could meet the trust mandate. So if there are no further questions, I'd like to turn it over.
Yes, Ted, please.
Just one quick question. In a conversation I had with somebody, it's obvious that there's some misunderstanding about what it is that the land board is going to do today. Could you clarify what it is you're asking the land board for today, just so people in their public testimony are aware of where we are in the process and where we're not in the process?
Thank you, Treasurer Wheeler. That's a point I probably should have made at the beginning. So what we've brought to you is it's really, there's a lot of detail, but it's still fairly general information about the possible future of the Elliott State Forest. What we've tried to do is present you with these 4 scenarios from which we hope you will be able to give us direction as a department, because we want to make sure that we're pursuing the path that you think is the most likely, the correct approach for the Elliott. We recognize, because the information is not 100% in depth at the level you'd need to make a final decision, that you may well ask us to look at more than one of the scenarios. You may ask us, quite frankly, to look at all 4 of them, but what we're hoping to do is get some direction and narrowing so that we can go out and do some due diligence and then come back to you to ask for a final decision once we've done a little bit more in-depth work. So I hope that's helpful in setting the stage.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, Governor.
Yeah, and if I could just say, certainly without attempting in any way to constrain what people say, but what would be very useful for us in the public testimony would be to address which ones, if any, of these options you think would be worthwhile pursuing. Because really what we're doing today is not making a decision on the future of the Elliott, but trying to find a pathway to engage many of the people who've been at odds over the years on this to find a path forward. So we will, I'm sure, recommend that the staff go back and flesh out one or more of these proposals, and so getting some indication from you about which one of those you feel worth pursuing would be very useful.
Okay, great. So with that, then I'm going to turn it over for the public comment. I will say that I think we have a limited amount of time, and so we're going to try and we're asking everyone to keep to 3 minutes with their comments. Stephanie Hallett-Cummins is here to be the timekeeper for us. And so she'll be helping people manage their time. And I'll just turn over this table. And Stephanie, I believe you're going to call up groups of people for testifying. Thank you very much.
Thank you, members of the board and Director Abrams. And actually, it's 10 o'clock. We need some time at the end for the land board to deliberate. So if you can keep your remarks closer to 2 minutes than 3, that would be great. I will be waving a 1-minute sign at you and a time is up sign at you if necessary. If you have written testimony, you can give it to Lorna at this table there. And I apologize in advance for anybody's name that I butcher when I am pronouncing them and calling you up. Please speak right into the mic. You heard that we need to be close to it for people to hear you. So with that, we'll start with Doug Robertson and Bob Reagan, please. Would you both come up?
Good morning. Governor Kitzhaber, Secretary of State Brown, and Treasurer Wheeler, it's a pleasure to be with you this morning. In the interest of time, I'm going to quickly review 3 issues that I would like to present for your consideration. The first being that I would encourage you to look, obviously, consideration on the Elliott, but broaden that perspective with the recognition of what is going on and has gone on in the last 3 decades, particularly in Southern Oregon, as it relates to the other public lands, the national forests, the O&C lands, the public domain lands, the Coos Bay Wagon Road lands, the county forest trust lands, all have been on a trajectory of diminishing availability of timber harvest. For many years, the Elliott historically has played a very important role of contributing to that wood basket, and I would ask that you consider that within the context of your work. Secondly, and I'm encouraged by the dialogue, while there are many deficiencies in the Northwest Forest Plan, as have all been recognized, there is an element that is helpful, and I think is actually being discussed, and that is the adaptive management area concept. The adaptive management area concept was included to address issues very much like you're facing today, and that is to identify areas where management is so constricted by a maze of rules and regulations and restrictions that they simply can't be managed. And based on the conversations that you've had, it appears that you're going in that direction. I think that's positive. Of course, jobs are at the key of the issues that you're well aware of in Southern Oregon and throughout the state in resource-dependent communities, and that is the bedrock of our economy, and I know you're taking that into consideration. And finally, let me just conclude by saying, many of you have heard me say it before, we can't change where we live. We can't change our geography. And it happens to be that we live among some of the most productive and valuable low-elevation timberlands in the world. And yet, because of the maze of restrictions and regulations and requirements, they cannot be managed for their stated purposes. We can do better than that. And by doing better, you will benefit the resource-dependent counties and communities, our economy, and our environment. Thank you.
Governor Kitzhaber, Secretary of State Kate Brown, and Treasurer Wheeler. My name is Bob Reagan. For the record, this is the 15th year I've been involved in us trying to solve this problem. You guys are kind of newcomers to the process, actually.
Not all of us.
Anyway, we have provided written comments for this hearing, which I submitted yesterday, but I wanted to use this opportunity to amplify the importance of the Elliott to Southwest Oregon timber industry. As you, Governor Kitzhaber, explained so well at the Board of Forestry meeting in Forest Grove a couple of years ago, rural counties in Oregon that contain substantial federal forest land ownership, primarily managed by the Forest Service and to a lesser extent the BLM, are largely behind in the economic recovery of our state because these federal forests contribute very little to the timber supply and generation of family wage jobs in our communities. That situation has not changed since you directed the board to get engaged in helping the federal agencies improve the active management of those forests. Let me put this predicament in the current perspective. In 2011, you, the board, approved a new management plan for those forests that raised cut from 25 million to 40 million feet to improve the financial performance of the forest. That harvest level is still only half of the annual growth. While the same implementation of the new harvest level has been suspended by litigation, the same is true of the national forests in our area. For example, the Umpqua National Forest, which is a 1 million-acre forest just east of Roseburg, last year struggled to sell 36 million board feet of timber, and this year they hope to sell 15 million feet of timber on a forest that's 10 times bigger than the Elliott. To the south, the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest is even larger than the Umpqua, and this year they hope to sell 15 million feet of timber. Our federal forests are just practically locked up. That is why the Elliott's important. I mean, you can potentially put a 40 million foot harvest level out on the straits could help all of us. Our infrastructure is operating at normal levels, but we are struggling to do so, and further south from Roseburg you go, the more difficult the situation gets. The alternatives project that you commissioned contains an alternative that we propose, which is simply to keep the Elliott in state ownership and implement the plan that you approved in 2011, but with a private manager in place of that Department of Forestry. We believe that plan can be implemented with a new manager employing a more robust science-based set of protocols for identifying nest trees and protecting them with scientifically determined disturbance buffers. The plan already has set aside 14,000 acres of the forest as the best habitat for murrelets, and by avoiding those acres and harvesting mature stands where nesting is not occurring, implementation can withstand the legal challenges that will surely come. We can't guarantee that a private entity will step forward and offer its management strategy with both legal and biological techniques for making the plan produce the outcomes that you proposed, but they do exist and are successfully managing forested lands within the range of the murrelet, the owl, and the coho salmon from Oregon border south, north to the Washington border. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Tom Wolf and Bob Van Dyke.
Governor Kitzhofer, Secretary of State Brown, Secretary of Treasurer Wheeler. For the record, my name is Tom Wolf. I'm the Executive Director of the Oregon Council of Trout Unlimited, representing the 3,000 members of Trout Unlimited here in Oregon. And in a matter of brevity, I always remember that the Gettysburg Address only took 2 minutes, so I'll be brief. Something that was brought up in that report is the immense amount of coho that are spawning in the Elliott State Forest. 22% of the spawning numbers in a 10-year average, 182,000 coho spawn on the Oregon coast, and approximately 40,000 spawn in the Elliott. The Elliott composes less than 2% of land on the Oregon coast, yet 22% of the coho spawn there. That's a very important number. That's a very important resource. Someday, when the Oregon coast coho is delisted and we're able to harvest more of the wild coho, they will become an important factor in the economic growth of fishing, both recreational and commercial. And the Elliott is a prime spawning area. So the Trout Unlimited recommends a couple things. First of all, that we look at alternatives 3 and 4, transfer of ownership either to another state agency, preferably state parks, or to a federal agency, U.S. Forest Service, or perhaps BLM. None of those are perfect, but we think that the salmon within the Elliott are an important resource for fishermen, both recreational and commercial, and for Oregonians. A report shows that Oregonians, even though 80% of Oregonians don't fish, think salmon are very important. So I think it deems us in the decision that must be made, the decision that ultimately you will make, we need to make sure that salmon for all Oregonians are protected, so that they can be a benefit to future generations, both our kids, our grandkids, and our great-grandkids. It's an important part of Oregon. I cannot think of Oregon without salmon. And because salmon are important, because they're so much a part of the Elliott, they must be considered in whatever plan has come up. Thank you so much.
Secretary Brown, Governor Kitzhaber, and Treasurer Wheeler. My name is Bob Van Dyke, and I work for the Wild Salmon Center. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I want to start today by saying that I've been really impressed by the process that the Department of State Lands has done, and the documents in particular really seem outstanding to me. They're very high-quality documents, and the staff have been very attentive to concerns I've had or questions that they've been developed. So I want to make sure I got that on the record. We certainly care about the salmon habitat too. Because of the shortage of time, I guess I'd say in terms of specific solutions, we'd encourage you to continue to pursue an HCP. It feels to us like you're going to need that given the endangered species that are there. Any manager will need that. So it'd be good to move that conversation forward. In terms of ownership, we support public ownership. It wouldn't necessarily have to be the Department of Forestry that's managing it or the land board that's formally the owner, but we'd like to see public ownership maintained. There's a bigger issue here, though, that we hope comes out of this process, and that's, it was mentioned earlier, the need for a mechanism more broadly to decouple lands that are encumbered, whether they're common school lands or Board of Forestry lands. There are common school lands, for example, on the North Coast that are very important, that are part of the Tillamook and Clatsop, that have endangered species there. That's not really an Elliott issue. Even in the Elliott, 10% of the Elliott is Board of Forestry land. So a bigger solution there that includes those has a slightly different issue than dealing with a common school mandate. So we'd encourage you, no matter what, to pursue something like that trust land transfer program to get that ball rolling during this legislative session. It feels to us like that might be something that's useful for years to come for other lands as well that are state-owned in other parts of the state. So thank you for the time to talk.
Thank you. I'm going to mispronounce this name, I'm sure. Dr. Jimmy Shopper and Christina Hubbard.
Good morning. Good morning. Just call me Jimmy. I'm not a medical doctor. I'm a quantitative industrial ecologist. But there is a link. You'll see that in a moment. The people who preceded actually helped set things up for me. So I'm going to narrow my focus. Important things coming out of the Elliott. Did that just trip off? Is the microphone still on?
No.
Try pushing the button.
One. Down.
There it goes.
Aha.
Don't move.
For people who follow on, there's a sweet spot on the push button. The important thing about Oregon's forests is they produce our air, our water, and the work of all the endangered species and threatened species you've talked about earlier. They're also very important in recycling marine-derived minerals. And I didn't see that specifically mentioned in any of the reports. It's sort of implicitly there. They're essential to our health. And the Elliott is especially important in the spawning and migration habitat that it provides for these species that impacts our fisheries and farming, all the farming, including organic farming, and that's why I'm really interested. I'm in my retirement. I'm trying to produce more organic farmers and watershed ecologists, because they will be increasingly important. In terms of Oregon's importance in organic farming, it's one of the 5 best places on the planet to produce vegetables and other organic crops, including a number of fiber crops that have industrial product potential. So in going along, please consider what this habitat is enabling us to do with our commercial fishing and farming industries. You take this habitat away, and you're going to collapse a lot more than $3 million for the state economy and affect the Common School Fund negatively. Now, I am an educator, so I want to see more resources for education, but we know that the bright people coming into these emerging industries that will be growing quite markedly here in the relatively near future. They're very bright people, and they want jobs. More than money, they value the habitat. They want clean air, clean water, and they do want those marine-derived minerals that are recycled by the salmon and even the marbled murrelet. Thank you.
Testing? Yeah, it works. He's right. It's a sweet spot. Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Christina Hubbard, chairperson of Forest Web of Cottage Grove, and I wanted to start by thanking the State Land Board for removing the disposal alternative for the Elliott. As I informed you at the October 8th meeting, public comment hearing, our organization's main mission is to promote the preservation of Oregon's old growth. We encourage public involvement and emphasize the critical role our state and federal forest lands play in mitigating the impact of climate change. The Elliott State Forest provides Forest Web and other environmental groups with an unparalleled teaching opportunity. We have led a number of educational field trips through this exceptional example of northwestern coastal rainforest, sharing this special forest with the residents of Oregon. And we have the privilege to show hike participants the Elliott's old growth that provides habitat for the endangered species and the beauty of the Millicoma River, which provides the surrounding communities with clean water. Unfortunately, the clear-cut logging that occurs in the Elliott also gives our guests a first-hand look at how public lands are managed under Oregon forest practices. Acres of steep hillsides covered in stumps, the soil eroding, slash piles waiting to be burned. On every field trip, we end up having to answer their questions about when they ask us why. It does not give either them or us any satisfaction when we explain that this is the way the state of Oregon manages their public lands. At many meetings and hearings, including today, I've heard representatives of the logging industry criticize how state and federal forests are managed. Their recommended solution is always the same: turn over public lands to be managed under private timber interests, more clear cuts, limited milling, and little or no taxes paid for the trees they cut. It is time to reevaluate Oregon forest practices in comparison to those of other states such as Washington and California. It is also time to look at how these states tax. Did you turn?
Lorna, can you see if it can be fixed?
I'll just. Okay. Is it working now?
Yes,
All right.
yes.
Sorry for the delay.
No problem.
It is also time to look at how these states tax the timber industry in comparison with the timber tax revenue collected in Oregon. And it is time to apply a true triple bottom line to the economics of our public forests: people, planet, and then profit. In my October comment, I'm going to drop that. I'll also ask you on behalf of our members to put the interests of the people of Oregon and the environment ahead of those of the timber industry. Protect our endangered species and clean water, and choose a solution for the Elliott that conserves and sustains what is most precious. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think if the next speakers don't touch it, it might be all right. You're going to. So the next two people are Jan Tetrault and Jerry Soli. I hope I pronounced those names correctly.
With your permission, I think you can all hear me. I just wander up there and get on the mic because I'm speaking very quickly. I've already sent my written
He's
comments
next.
in,
He's next.
I do appreciate back to the original charter on the Elliott, which was non-declining sustainable harvest. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, my name is Jerry Solly, and I live in Ash Valley. I'm a neighbor with Elliott, and I'm really concerned about selling the Elliott. It's a wonderful place, and I'm a retired educator, and I purchased the Ash Valley School up there, and I've owned it for many years. And what I would like to see Elliott do in the state would be to reinvest some of the monies that would go back into the school fund for further expansion of future investments. And you could even buy more land and do sustained planting and harvesting of those crops of the forest. And that way you could leave some of the other intact. And this is a long-term goal. I mean, it's going to take years, which it has. But one of the things I hate to see somebody jump too fast is that we've been through a terrible recession, and everybody's felt an economic pinch, and that's part of why I think the Elliott is producing as much too, as well as anybody. The prices are low, so everybody's lost out. And give it another chance. Give it a few more years, and reinvest some. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Gordon Ross and Pamela Morris.
Good to see you, Landlord.
Hello.
I hope you'll throw me a little slack. I don't
Hello.
speak as fast as some people do. I've been attending land board meetings for over 25 years, and every one of the members felt their fiduciary responsibility. In all those years, I've watched us try to meet the requirements of the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and the Endangered Species Act. Some of it's been confusing, and that's resulted in a lot of litigation. For instance, the spotted owl enhancement plan. In the text, it said that the spotted owls need 22,000 acres to fledge in one pair. Yet, on the front cover, there's a spotted owl flying down to catch a mouse on a stump in the middle of a clear cut. And when we harvest and plant, we have old trees and we have young trees. So, in doing that, we fulfill the need of the owls. I believe both the owl and the murrelet were predicated to be threatened on the extremity of their habitat. As you go south, there's more and more spotted owls. You get down to Arizona, and there's hundreds of them fledging in the ground. You go north with the
1 minute.
With the murrelet, and you have the same thing till you get up in the Aleutians, and you've got lots of marble murrelets. I think what I want to say, I forget, I think one or two was, if we put it under management, private management, under the Forest Practices Act, then the logger, when he gets ready, he has to make a plan. That plan takes into consideration all the environmental and slope and so forth. As long as he goes by that plan, then he'll be safe, and we won't have that. And that's it. One thing other, I will write a letter to you, Governor, with the passing of the Marijuana Act, we have young people in danger. My proposal is a very stiff penalty for anyone being caught providing our young people with
Thank you, Mr. Ross. We need to get back to the Elliott.
Thank you.
Thanks, sir.
I'll write you a letter, and good to see you.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Governor.
See you, Gordon.
Hope the letter gets to you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good to see you, Mr. Ross.
Thank
Thanks
you
for
very
being
much.
here.
I got to go home because you know what I haul.
Yes, I do. Travel
All right.
safely.
Thank you so much.
Pamela Morris.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Pamela Morris. I've been a Portland resident for 8 years, but before that I spent over 20 years as an environmental attorney to the United States Department of the Navy. And as a senior attorney in the Office of the Secretary, my job was to help those attorneys in the field who had difficulty reaching agreement with the resource agencies like Fish and Wildlife or National Marine Fisheries Service that would allow them to reach agreement on a plan that would let the Navy accomplish what it was required to do. I have great sympathy for the Oregon Department of Forestry in trying to develop a habitat conservation plan. Congress, in enacting the Endangered Species Act, had a very laudable goal of preserving species in danger of extinction, but it left to the rest of us to figure out the means by which they would accomplish that goal. And just as Willie Sutton once said that the reason he robbed banks was because that's where the money is, these agencies often go after state and other federal agencies because they think that's where the money is. Unfortunately, this is not the case in Oregon, whose public schools cannot, who cannot afford to divert funding from education to species preservation. The Elliott State Forest was established to support Oregon's schools, and our schools desperately need that support. My daughters were lucky to be educated in the state of Virginia. In Oregon, had they been educated here, they would have had a year less schooling by the time they went to college. The State Land Board must treat the Elliott as a much-needed source of revenue for Oregon's schools, and the forest's most viable means of getting that revenue is through logging. Unfortunately, after years of trying, it seems unlikely that the state and federal government will reach agreement on a habitat conservation plan. One way to lessen the shackles of the Endangered Species Act is to remove the forest from state ownership. It's much harder for federal agencies to impose costly requirements on private landowners than on state agencies, and private landowners make more sympathetic defendants in environmental litigation. Therefore, I urge the State Land Board to consider selling the Elliott and investing the proceeds in a way that will support the Common School Fund. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The next three people wanted to come up together, so perhaps two could sit at the table and one could be on deck. John Charles, Katherine Walter, and Eric Fruits.
Thank you, Governor, members of the board. My name is John Charles, President of Cascade Policy Institute, a nonprofit policy research center. Now, my 19th year advocating on this particular topic. 15 months ago, we hired 3 teams of consultants to try and advise us on the same issues that you are trying to figure out. I hired a legal team to look at fiduciary trust, an economic team to model potential sale of the forest, and a policy research team to look at all other options other than selling. They've produced their reports. We previously sent them to you. I hope you've received them. I hope they've provided some help in this effort to figure out a way to get to yes. And 2 of the consultants are here today. Katherine Walter on my right is an attorney, and Eric Fruits to my far right is an economist. My brief comments about the 4 recommendations, turning to them, they don't seem to recognize seriously the concept of fiduciary trust. As staff report notes, quote, the land board must have a rational, non-speculative basis for concluding that its investment choices will maximize economic return to the Common School Fund over the long term. Yet the least speculative, highest yielding option would be to sell the entire forest, and that is not in the final 4 of options to go forward with further study. The fact that it is the least speculative is seen in Figure 8, page 12 of the Evergreen report that you have. The options that are recommended all involve continued delay with major risks of indefinite losses well into the future on the forest. call your attention also to Table 8 of the DSL staff report on page 54. DSL itself recommended in 1995 that the land board sell all the common school trust property. That was ignored by the land board. The ESF was then valued at $850 million. The failure of the land board over the next 18 years resulted in a loss of $1.4 billion in value for schools, as shown on Table 8. Even by the standards of Oregon school spending, $1.4 billion is a big number. And the forest is now valued at roughly $350 million. So you already know that the non-sale options under continued public ownership haven't worked. While a sale would allow you to add cash to the CSF corpus, where it has historically earned 8% annually. The staff recommendation violates the prudent investor standard by ignoring 20 years' worth of empirical evidence and also by consciously settling for 1 to 3% return when the rest of the CSF gets 8% return. Staff report repeatedly refers to the number of people who have called for continued public ownership. I just remind you, this is not a popularity contest. This is about fiduciary obligation. As trustees, I believe you have an obligation to at least go into the due diligence phase, keeping a public sale option as part of the mix. Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Good morning. My name is Katherine Walter. I studied environmental engineering at MIT, and I attended Lewis and Clark Law School and received an environmental law certificate. I in part chose to go there because of my interest in environmental issues, but education remains a top priority for me. The high school I attended in a small town in Michigan, although it was a public school, received funding from large companies like Pfizer and Stryker. This funding allowed it to graduate students who consistently matriculated to the top universities. This was a fortunate and atypical high school, not dependent on income from trust assets. Over the past year, I researched the law of trust intensively, and I wrote a legal memorandum regarding my findings, which has previously been sent to the State Land Board, and lays out more thoroughly the availability of certain options within the fiduciary constraints. Funding common schools has been a concern since our nation's inception. The federal government attempted to provide in part for Oregon schools by granting, in trust, certain real property assets to be used to benefit the school children. A trustee has certain inalienable fiduciary obligations. A trustee is expected to exercise reasonable care and skill in managing trust assets. A trustee must preserve trust property, but also make it productive. And a trustee must act with absolute loyalty to the beneficiaries of the trust. A significant trust asset, the Elliott State Forest, which is worth millions, has not been maximally managed. It is important to give a voice to the thousands of Oregon school children who are negatively impacted by funding issues as a result of this management. The State Land Board is in an unenviable position, but the law of trust is clear and requires trust assets to be managed for one sole purpose, to benefit the beneficiaries. This is the fiduciary obligation of the board. Doing nothing is not an option, and to this point has left the trust with a substantially devalued asset. That said, we have options on the table, as we've discussed today. The Elliott State Forest could be sold in an auction. A habitat conservation plan could be negotiated, or a land exchange or transfer with the federal government or other entity could be arranged. But also, as we discussed today, whatever the option is, it must maximize the benefit to Oregon students. Of these options, a public auction must seriously be considered, as it has the potential to fully realize the value of the Elliott State Forest. When selecting an option, it is critical that the board remember that a net positive result is not good enough. Even a modest profit would not satisfy the obligations of the trustee, where the asset is as valuable as the Elliott State Forest. A trustee must obtain the greatest benefit for the trust beneficiaries. Thank you for your careful consideration of the next steps you'll take with respect to managing the Elliott State Forest for the school children beneficiaries.
Good morning. Good morning, Governor Kitzhaber, Secretary of State Brown, Treasurer Wheeler. My name's Eric Fruits. I'm an Oregon economist, and I spoke to the land board almost 5 years ago to the day about selling the Elliott State Forest. And when I say sell, I use that as a shorthand to mean it could be a sale or a transfer or a long-term lease. It's some sort of arrangement that would provide a lump sum of money that could then be invested and then drawn down or use those investment earnings to fund the Common School Fund. Since then, if our advice had been taken then and the Elliott State Forest had been disposed of or sold in 2010, we would have had $40 million in the Common School Fund. What's really curious about that time that I talked about 5 years ago, and I feel like an old timer, but I know I'm a youngster compared to some of these people who have been involved in this. 5 years ago, the Elliott State Forest made $6.1 million. And even then, there was a concern that there was a violation of fiduciary duty. So to answer the question of what's the right amount, losing money is certainly a breach. Zero is probably a breach. And even $6 million a year might be a breach of fiduciary duty. I'm not a lawyer, but I just wanted to flag that as something that I recall from last time we were here. The Elliott's a valuable asset. As John Charles pointed out, back in 1995, the State Land Board valued the Elliott State Forest at $850 million. In the analysis that I did, I said that $750 million was reasonable based on the information I had at that time. Today, now there's a valuation of the Elliott State Forest at about $350 million. So not only are we losing money on the state forest itself, in other words, we're not providing money to the Common School Fund. We're taking money out of the Common School Fund. That's money that's coming out of the students and out of the teachers. We also have a diminishing asset value. If we did sell the Elliott State Forest, when I did my analysis, I said that it could probably bring in about $53 million a year. That was based on that higher value. Using the value we have today, it could still bring in $25 million a year. $25 million is a lot compared to what we're getting now, and it's about twice as much as we were getting even in the late 1990s. And that's if we put the money in the same investments that we have for PERS. The Common School Fund has a slightly lower return. If we put it in the Common School Fund investments and got those same sorts of returns that those financial instruments are getting, we would probably get about $25 million in my original report. Now, if we use that revised value, it'd still be $12 million, which is $12 million more than we're getting now. So as we're going forward, I think that you really need to consider not just the issue of how much money are we pulling out of the Common School Fund, how much money could we put into the Common School Fund, but also that as we wait, we are seeing a diminishing value of that Elliott State Forest asset. And I'm sure I'm out of time, and so I'll let the next person speak. Thank you.
Thank you. Katja Kohler and Santiago Gauss. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Thank you for. Is that working? Oh, I have to push it. Oh, don't push it. You're good.
Okay. Thanks. Yeah, I'd like to recommend to leave the Elliott as public lands and don't allow it to become a private forest or for the private forest industry to manage it. I live on 7 acres in Cottage Grove, and we farm. All around us are private forest lands, plantations pretty much. We also have many clear cuts that are sprayed with herbicides. Last spring, a helicopter flew over us, and we experienced chemical trespass. We got sick. One of our sons, actually Santiago Gaz, had bloody noses for 3 days. And we lost crops and livestock. It's a bad idea to allow private timber to manage our forests. We need to figure out other ways to raise funds for schools, like taxing timber companies so they pay equivalent to the percent we pay on our properties. And we need to look at carbon sequestration. These mature old-growth forests are more valuable intact for our future, for our kids, for their future. And the amount that funds schools now is so minuscule, about 1% of the whole school budget, that we should easily be able to figure out how to make that money in other more environmentally friendly ways that secure a healthy future for our children. Thank you for listening. And I'd be interested in looking at how much, the paperwork says $400 million has been made since 1933, which if you divide that by the number of years, 85, to then the number of schools that we have in Oregon, I figured out, just a quick figure, I'm not a mathematician or an economist, but that turned out to be about $3,000 a year for schools. It just feels like we could certainly try to make that in other ways that secures, takes care of our mature and old growth forests. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
not working?
Get right up next to it.
I am a student here in Oregon, and you're talking about funding schools like the one I go to. And a lot of my fellow classmates encouraged me to speak here today. We all share in the opinion that the best way to support our education and provide us with a meaningful future is to protect our ancient, irreplaceable forests, not cut them down. There are lots of other ways to derive profit from a forest without destroying it. For example, I have friends in Cottage Grove who make the trek to the Elliott to harvest mushrooms because it's such a large and contiguous ecosystem, and then the coho salmon as well. The Elliott obviously has value as a recreation spot, something that should be looked into as a viable source of income. Forests are more valuable if kept intact due to the carbon they sequester. There is even money to be made in trading carbon credits. We need to get beyond just cutting trees to make money. There are lots of alternative ways to grow our economy that will better prepare us for the future, such as expanding technology, medical and healthcare, and renewable energy jobs, encouraging entrepreneurship, and supporting local farms and other small businesses. I want to encourage you all to protect the Elliott Forest from logging and keep it available for my generations and the ones to come. Thank you.
Thank you. Jennifer Haynes and Bob Solinger.
Yeah, it's good. Exactly. It's good.
Extra credit, maybe.
That's a hard act to follow. Governor Kitzhaber, Secretary Brown, Treasurer Wheeler. My name is Jennifer Haynes, and I'm here to present oral testimony of the Oregon League of Women Voters based on the more detailed written report I've provided you with. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization that encourages informed citizen participation in government. Please consider these comments as you deliberate on a recommendation in moving forward with options for how the Elliott Forest could be owned and managed. The League acknowledges this is a very difficult issue because of an outdated arrangement that couples a pristine forest ecosystem to school funding. Our schools and protection of our forest are both important, and one should not have to be chosen at the expense of the other. The League of Women Voters believes that natural resources such as forests and the animals and plants living within them should be managed as interrelated parts of life-supporting ecosystems. Resources should be conserved and protected to assure their future availability. These native rainforests that have never been logged provide critical habitat for a host of species, as you know, teetering on the brink of extinction, like the marbled murrelet and northern spotted owl. Oregon should shelve any plan that would privatize this incredible asset, removing government protections. We believe decoupling school funding in Oregon from clear-cutting to protect old and mature growth areas in the Elliott is critical, and we support a recommendation that the Land Board should work toward disconnecting the forest from education funding. The project report suggests 4 transition scenarios, as you know, each having strengths and weaknesses. The League would like to remind the Land Board that these scenarios are not set in stone. The best transition scenario and the best management strategy decouples old growth clear-cutting from school funding, protects the Elliott's remaining native forests, wild salmon, and imperiled wildlife, safeguards the Elliott for public recreation and education, promotes timber jobs by restoratively thinning the second growth tree farms, and opposes privatization. In conclusion, the Elliott State Forest has become an Oregon icon as something other than just an investment that is meant to earn an income. As such, the League supports a plan to decouple the school funding from timber receipts from the Elliott, replace those receipts through more responsible sources, and keep the Elliott State Forest as a public treasure for future generations, like the young man that just spoke. Thank you.
Good morning, Governor Kitzhaber, Secretary Brown, and Treasurer Wheeler. Thanks for holding this hearing today. My name is Bob Solinger, and I'm testifying on behalf of the Audubon Society of Portland and our 14,000 members. First off, I wanted to express my appreciation to the Division of State Lands and the Alternatives Project. I think they did a really nice job on this. It was inclusive. I thought the reports, I'd echo Bob Van Dyke, the reports are good, they're clear, they're easy to understand. So I think it's been a good process to date. You've heard it before, but I'll say it again. The Elliott's an amazing place, 93,000 acres. 41,000 of those are older forests, some of the most pristine streams for coho and coast range, critical habitat for marble murrelets and spotted owls. This is a place that really does need to be protected. I want to highlight a couple of things that I read in the report that I haven't really heard much about today. One is public auction being off the table for now. We think that's the right decision to take it off the table, but it should be forever. The public auction alternative basically is predicated on the idea that private entities could log where the state could not. And that's predicated on the idea that you could log in spotted owl and marble murrelet habitat. That's not where we want to go with this. It shouldn't be a viable option. I appreciate the focus on non-market values that was highlighted in the report. It's a start. We need to keep going with that. There's a lot of opportunity there. We talk about it a lot. We need to find a way to actually use those concepts. And I appreciate the fact that I think some of these alternatives will stimulate that kind of creative thinking. So that's exciting. Third, the recognition that we don't need to maximize revenue today, that we need to have a long-term approach. This is going to take patience, and we need to have it. So some of the principles that we work off of that we think should be sideboards on any decision on these four options: maintain public ownership, decouple the common school fund, protect trees over 100 years old, as well as other wildlife values like clean water, wildlife, and habitat, promote timber jobs by restorative thinning in the dense second growth forests, and provide public access recreational opportunities. We think those are critical. We've looked at the four options. We're still evaluating them. We tend to lean towards the final two, the request for ownership proposals and potential transfer. We think those probably get better at some of these values, but we're still evaluating them. We also recognize there may be a mix and match. What concerns us about the first two proposals: one, cutting trees over 100 years old. It's going to force you to cut in older habitat. Secondly, it doesn't decouple the common school fund. We think we have a huge opportunity here to move beyond that, to move beyond the conflicts that are inherent in funding schools with timber harvest. We think we need to break that chain. If we're interested in getting beyond lawsuits, we think that's a critical element of any solution, whether it's 1 through 4. To really set a standard for protecting older forests, I think that will provide those kinds of opportunities. And to really protect listed species. What do we need to do to really protect the coho, the marble murrelets, and the spotted owl? It's not the bare minimum required under law, but to really create an optimal opportunity, because this is really incredible habitat. So I will end there, but we're leaning toward the third and fourth options. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Rick Ritter and Eric Geyer.
Marble murrelet over there. Sounds like it.
Welcome. I'm not sure how to turn this.
You're good.
It's on.
Am I good now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, thank you. Governor Kitzhaber, Treasurer Wheeler, Secretary Brown, thank you for being so patient with the public. I'll be very brief because I'm going to get a parking ticket in a few minutes. I don't have any prepared script. I've heard some wonderful things here. I think we cannot afford to keep looking into the past. Remember in the good old days of about 100 years ago, we used to clear-cut everything and float the logs down the Willamette River and the environment be damned. We can't keep doing that. We have to look forward. We've got climate change looming. New York Times has said that the Northwest is going to become a magnet because we have water, we have environment, we're going to draw people from the arid southern regions where it will not be tolerable to continue living. We need to use the Elliott State Forest. Our job is to grow jobs. It's not to grow a tree farm. The Elliott State Forest, as an intact forest, can manufacture, can produce income in a variety of ways that don't involve clear cuts. I think it's a great idea to transfer ownership out of the common school fund, relieve the school fund of the obligation of managing a forest, trying to please everybody. I'd like to encourage you to create a separate state entity to manage that forest, kind of a clean slate that can focus on the health and future of the Elliott State Forest. We all are going to love and respect that beautiful piece of Oregon. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Good morning, Governor Kitzhaber, Secretary Brown, Treasurer Wheeler. My name is Eric Geyer. I'm here with Roseburg Forest Products. Now, Roseburg has been the largest purchaser of logs off of the Elliott for many years, and it supplies our rural plywood plants in Coquille, Riddle, and Dillard. I'd like to thank the department today for such a thorough report on the alternatives for the Elliott State Forest. And I'd also like to stress that the goal should be that we come up with a long-term solution that provides certainty for timber volume and also meets the trust obligation. In brief, I have 3 requests for your consideration today. Number 1, that each alternative be evaluated to meet that trust obligation. I was intrigued with the question, Treasurer Wheeler, from you earlier on that topic. And I would submit that there is a metric that needs to be met there. It's known at this point we have some value to that property. It was assessed, and it also was verified through the public auction of a few parcels recently. And I think anything short of that would not meet that obligation. Number 2, the public auction was taken off the table. And we would support that at this point as a specific alternative. We have been on record several times as saying that our preference would be for the state ownership of the forest. However, we believe that the public auction should be retained as a backstop to ensure that that trust obligation will be met. Number 3, the science of the murrelet is really what will drive the management of the future going forward. That science continues to evolve. I'm not sure we understand enough today to really assess what that management will look like. And I'd like to ask for your support for the continued research on the murrelet. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Max Gauss and Grace Pettigrove.
Welcome.
My name is Max Gauss, and I'm a sophomore at Cottage Grove High School. If we continue to cut down forests at the current pace, my generation and the next might not be able to do what I was just doing there, breathing, in the future. Using the Elliott as a source of income for schools is lazy, ill-advised, and counterproductive. If you genuinely cared about the future of the youth and sustaining a quality of living, you would maintain a healthy environment and an array of natural historical treasures. Keep these forests for our future. Try and look at the bigger picture instead of a quick fix for a bit of extra money to buy some extra school supplies or new football equipment. I wanted to be able to go on hikes to a healthy forest with my kids, go mushroom hunting, fishing, or camping, as probably all of you have done, without having to bear witness to the man-made destruction on our ecology. I know there are many hoops and hurdles to conquer, and the whole situation isn't as black as white as some people make it to be. But you adults grew up with these natural resources, so please try and make sure you leave some for us behind.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Grace Pettigrove. I'm a volunteer with Coast Range Forest Watch, which is a forest monitoring group that's based out of Coos Bay. I do murrelet surveys. I have a professional training to do that, and we do them voluntarily to monitor the population in the Elliott State Forest. I'm mostly here today representing myself, though. I work in public schools right now. That's my day job. I'm hearing that the option of public auction of the Elliott State Forest is at least temporarily being taken off the table, and I'm really grateful for that. I think this is one of the first times I've really felt like the public comment that's been given to you all is being taken seriously. So I appreciate that, and I sincerely hope that that is true and remains true. I support management of the Elliott that leaves the never-before logged portions of the forest untouched, and the 93,000 acres public. A perspective that I think has been well established by many groups and individuals at these meetings. I really like the option of public transfer to like a different public manager. That sounds really cool to me. But I think lots of people already said made really good points today that I agree with. I wanted to focus today on the Palouse Creek watershed near North Bend. There are 3 parcels there that you approved for public auction last December called the Adams Ridge parcels. One of those parcels has already been auctioned to a timber company who plans to log it despite well-documented presence of nesting marble murrelets. Our group has seen them there, and I believe state surveyors have also documented them there in the past. And the Palouse Creek watershed is critical habitat for spawning coho, and it's also been well established during this meeting that the Elliott State Forest is a very significant habitat for the spawning coho. And it's also a really popular recreation area for people in the Coos Bay and North Bend area. Thanks. We've actually done dozens of hikes there as our group, so I can testify just visually. I've seen hundreds of people go hiking in that area and enjoy that area, mushroom hunting, fishing, and whatnot. I think it would be unethical and incredibly unpopular for the state to continue with the sale of the remaining parcels. And I know that you approved those parcels because you wanted to assess the value of the whole forest. That seems really unnecessary now. So I just wanted to ask that you formally end the sale of those parcels. And yeah, that's all I wanted to say today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Just so everyone knows, we have 15 more people signed up to testify, and the next 2 will be Heath Curtis and Rhett Lawrence.
Morning.
Welcome.
Governor Kitzhaber, Treasurer Wheeler, Secretary Brown. My name is Heath Curtis, and I'm here on behalf of the Oregon Forest Industries Council. OFIC represents the state's industrial timberland owners and manufacturers who use forest products as manufacturing inputs. We're here because ownership and management of the Elliott impacts those manufacturers, and manufacturing infrastructure impacts private timberland owners. Without milling infrastructure, trees don't have much commercial value, whether public or private. So I've got 3 items I'd like to cover with you quickly. The first is that we believe that the public auction alternative should not be discarded. We're impressed by the evergreen economics analysis, and given the large delta between the public auction alternative and any other management scenario, at a minimum, a net present value of $150 million, it's difficult to understand how DSL can be so confident regarding the feasibility of other alternatives to meet its trust obligations that public auction doesn't need continued diligence at this time. Nevertheless, even if it requires little due diligence, other alternatives should be analyzed relative to and buttressed by the public auction alternative. Second, with regard to the trust beneficiaries, DSL's alternatives report indicates that some fraction of the trust beneficiaries may have been satisfied with a compromised market return given the Elliott's non-market values. I would caution you, however, that there's no single entity that can speak for the schools as a whole, right? And there's no majority vote. That is to say, your fiduciary duties run to each school individually, and likewise, each of those schools would be in a position to litigate if, in fact, they believed that you were compromising those fiduciary duties. In that light, we would counsel careful outreach and approval from the schools most likely to be dissatisfied with your alternative rather than those most likely to approve it. Finally, in our view, the State Land Board can best preserve and enhance the value of the Elliott now and in the future by investing in the science surrounding listed species that may reside on state lands. In the absence of good science, land managers are forced to manage very conservatively, given the benefit of the doubt to the species. This can be costly, as evidenced by the decline in timber revenues from the Elliott following the recent marble mullet litigation. Any alternative not involving disposition should be supported by an aggressive and robust listed species research and monitoring program. And just very quickly, to your points, Treasurer Wheeler, before about the highest bid, whether you would be obligated to take it, I would posit to you that the highest bid, in fact, defines the market value. And the delta for any alternative that you choose between the highest bid and that alternative would have to be covered in any disposition scheme under scenario number 3 you can't just cut a special deal for a public entity without making the Common School Fund whole. So thanks for taking my comments. Thank you.
Governor Kitts Harbor, Secretary of State Brown, Treasurer Wheeler. Good morning. My name is Rhett Lawrence. I'm the Conservation Director for the Oregon Chapter of the Sierra Club. And on behalf of the 20,000 members and supporters of the Sierra Club in Oregon, I want to thank you for hearing my brief comments today, and I will keep them brief. You heard from me in Coos Bay, and I've submitted written comments as well. I did want to thank you up front for the process that you've embarked on here. I do think you've done some great work with the Elliott Alternatives Project. Have engaged a bunch of stakeholders, and I really appreciate that, and think we've got a good product that came out of it. And did want to urge you at the outset to follow the recommendations from that report and give priority to the solutions that keep the Elliott in public ownership. Sierra Club firmly believes that our state should not have to choose between protecting salmon, clean water, and old growth, and logging to fund education, on the other hand. And as others have said already today, continuing to tie education funding to timber receipts is a failed policy of the past, and we need new solutions. So we're glad you have embarked on this process. We do believe that there is room on the Elliott for some sustainable timber production through thinning projects. Obviously, a bunch of educational or recreational opportunities are available there. We need to develop those, and so we look forward to working with the land board members, your staff, and DSL to work through the scenarios that you've been presented, and are very pleased that the public auction to the highest bidder has been taken off the table. But again, what we really need to do is to sever that tie between the Common School Fund and timber. And Sierra Club stands ready to assist you in engaging in a conversation with legislative leaders to figure out what that approach might be. And as a final note, I guess we would say that we would prefer options 3 or 4 as ways to sever that tie between the Common School Fund and timber. So again, thank you for all your work on this. Thank you for considering my comments, and look forward to working with you further.
Thank you.
Thanks. Jim Green or Greer, and Josh Laughlin.
All right. How's everybody doing?
Good.
Good morning, Secretary, Governor, Treasurer. Thanks for the opportunity to provide input this morning. My name is Josh Laughlin. I'm the campaign director of Cascadia Wildlands based in Eugene, representing 20,000 members and supporters, most of whom are in Oregon, with a real vested interest in finding a permanent solution for the Elliott State Forest. Reading through the public comments that the state received during the last few month public comment period was eye-opening for me. I hand-counted every single one of them. I counted 1,147 out of 1,185 commenters, or 97% of them advocated for some sort of conservation solution for the Elliott that decouples older forest clear-cutting from school funding and safeguards the forest for the clean water it provides, the fishing and hunting opportunities it offers for the carbon storage at no cost to us to mitigate climate change and other outstanding values that Oregonians cherish. These were comments from teachers' associations. They were comments from hunters, fishermen, fisherwomen, conservation organizations, landowners adjacent to the Elliott, regular old people who want to see some sort of a conservation solution. Taking any further disposal of the Elliott off the table was the right decision and in the public interest. We thank you for that. I believe we're on the cusp of solving the Elliott conundrum that will result in lasting protections for the iconic rainforest while at the same time meeting school fund obligations. I believe the time is ripe, and we are going to push a conservation solution with stakeholders across the finish line with ongoing diligence and leadership in Salem. We're committed to working with you all. I think you should take a look at the $5.3 million net figure that came off the Elliott. It was an average for the 5 years leading up to the injunction in 2012. That figure apparently met the school fund. I believe there's an opportunity to leverage a subsidy to replace that in Salem, to decouple clear-cutting old-growth forests with school funding. A few of the outcomes that we want to see in this process: permanent protection for the remaining 41,000 acres of old-growth, mature and old-growth forests on the forests. You all know the values those provide. Protection for streamside areas for the outstanding coho value, restoration jobs, restoratively thinning the dense tree farms on the forest. I think there's a real opportunity to strike an agreement with lasting benefits for Oregonians. Reading through the alternatives, leaning towards 3 and 4, I think there's opportunities to have a lot more due diligence and further discussion. And I think we need to just ultimately get beyond trying to squeeze the Elliott for all we can and actually recognize we're continuing to beat our heads against the wall here and finally decouple this archaic scheme of clear cutting. I call it clear cuts for kids strategy that's not working, and we need to move beyond that once and for all. That's going to benefit Oregonians and kids moving into the future. Thank you again, and look forward to working with you all.
Thanks very much. Kate? Yeah, Kate. Okay. Jim?
Good morning, Governor, Secretary Brown, Treasurer Wheeler. First and foremost, I want to thank Mary Abrams and Jim Paul and their staff. They've done an outstanding job of putting together alternatives for you to take a look at. I'm here on behalf of the Oregon School Boards Association. And I'm so glad to see a very diverse crowd here today to talk about school funding, because that's what we're talking about. This is about the Common School Fund and the assets and the trust of the Common School Fund. And I know the three of you particularly have been dealing with this issue for quite some time. I've been dealing with school funding since 1991, and I think one of the things we need to take a look at is also our endangered species of kids in our schools who haven't seen cut days, who haven't seen teachers laid off, who haven't seen programs eliminated. And one of the assets we have in order to help school funding is the Elliott State Forest. I've looked at all the alternatives, been part of the stakeholder group that the Division of State Lands put together, and I have to tell you, I think the crux of the issue gets at what Treasurer Wheeler talked about, which is the maximizing of the benefit for the Common School Fund. You've heard people today talk about decoupling school funding from our assets within the Common School Fund, particularly logging on either the Elliott or other public funds. I have to warn you a little bit about that, because if you look at the analysis today, it's done on the value of the Elliott Forest sitting there today, $350 million. You can't just look at it as today, because the fund doesn't just benefit kids that are in school today, it benefits the next generation and the next generation of students. So I would caution you from decoupling. I understand from the report you're going to need to access some of the Common School Funds to further develop and study some of the recommendations. As one of the beneficiaries, the Oregon School Boards Association, representing school board members from across the state, we support using those funds to further develop a strategy that will work going forward to ensure that we do maximize the Common School Fund and the assets of the Common School Fund for the benefit of all kids moving forward. Litigation on these issues is hurting everyone. It has cost the Common School Fund $3 million last year alone. That is in violation of your fiduciary duty. I don't have the perfect answer, and you find yourself in quite a conundrum. But I can offer you, from the resources of the Oregon School Boards Association, we will help you through this process. We will work with you and talk to you about how we do maximize the benefit of the Elliott and our other statutory and constitutional lands for the benefit of the Common School Fund. I don't think the public options that you see, if you read the report, are the best ones that are out there. I think you need to balance them, maybe look at a hybrid of a variety of them. And again, I think you ought to take the time, the money, and the resources that are available to study them more fully. I think some better science on what we do with endangered species in the Elliott is also needed, and we support that in every way going forward. Again, we stand ready to help you, because we know it's not just for this generation of kids, but as we move forward with each generation of our public school kids as they come through. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you.
Kate has a couple
question.
questions. Yep.
Josh, you mentioned subsidy in terms of moving the forest away from or decoupling. Where are folks talking about the subsidy coming from?
Yeah, I've been trying to do as much possible research and investigation into this, talking with different legislators to get ideas about, for those 5 years leading up to the injunction in 2012, the average net revenue that came off the Elliott, $5.3 million. I mean, if we can, like I've said to you guys before, if we could put a man on the moon, I think we can come up with $5.3 million and keep these old growth forests standing for all the outstanding values they provide. I think there should be a lot of time dedicated to looking into different bonding options, whether it's through lottery bonding, general bonding authority, general appropriations. I mean, big picture, $5 million is not a lot of money. And continuing to work with you all and legislators in Salem to come up with what I would consider, not a huge sum of money, I think is very doable. So I look forward to more conversations.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Kelsey Revis and Chandra Lague.
Excuse me. Hello, Secretary, Treasurer, and Governor. My name is Kelsey Revis, and my family owns property adjacent to the Elliott on 10 Mile Lakes. And first off, I'd like to say that this is not about the Common School Fund. And if it is, that's kind of ridiculous considering that it's 1% of Oregon's annual budget for the General Education Fund, as it's stated in the DSL report. It's about protecting a native old-growth forest that's in jeopardy. Anyways, back to my speech. I wasn't going to speak again today, but then I had a dream about the State Land Board last night. The meeting was at Kate's house.
Sounds terrible.
Tell me about it. No, the meeting was at Kate's house, and I have no idea what it looks like, honest. And several... Several of us sat at a kitchen table together drinking coffee. We connected as people, joked around, and the governor even took a bite out of Dan's cheese sandwich when he wasn't looking. And we could ask questions like, why are you hesitant about restoration jobs instead of timber jobs? Why don't you release your fiduciary responsibility, since that's a viable option at this point? And what was up with all those shady timber campaign contributions we keep bringing up? Anyways, we all left the house in a good mood and feeling better understood. The governor said there would be no more clear cutting, only minimal thinning. But then I woke up. The Elliott is something the environmental community, the wildlife, the salmon, the atmosphere, the people cannot afford to lose, but something I believe the state's budget can handle. The reality is that the Elliott's contribution is less than a quarter of 1% to the annual school budget. And saying Oregon school children rely or even benefit significantly from the Elliott is an ill-informed argument, to say the least. This is certainly reason enough to decouple old-growth logging from funding for schools. With that said...
1 minute.
Thank you. It is not in the best interest of the state for the Elliott to be owned by the schools. Even with a stricter HCP, we'll still have the same conflict because conservation efforts will not go away, because climate change is the most imminent threat facing our generation. I do appreciate the DSL's alternatives report and the extraordinary efforts put forth by the public to preserve this carbon storing jewel. I also support management that protects the 40,000 acres of native forest and to not sell Adams Ridge 2 and 3 because the most productive stream in Oregon for coastal coho salmon runs through those parcels. And the environmental cost would be far greater than any revenue you could gain from timber sales. So I believe that turning the native Elliott into a state park or wildlife reserve through the Trust Lands Transfer Program is the best option. And last December, I said I wanted to hike through the Elliott with my children. Well, now I can say I want to walk through the Elliott with my son this summer and indefinitely. If you preserve the Elliott and other native forests for anyone, it should be the unborn. And my son is here to testify. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, Treasurer, Governor, Secretary. My name is Chandra Lagui. Sorry, you did your best on the pronunciation. It's a hard one. And I work for Oregon Wild, so I'm representing our 14,000 or so members and supporters who support our mission to protect and restore Oregon's wildlands, wildlife, and waters. And we usually deal primarily with federal public lands, but the Elliott's so important that we're wading into this one as well, and it's such a wonderful area, so very close to the Siuslaw National Forest that I work a lot personally on, and I've been working to protect the Devil's Staircase Wilderness just on the other side of the river from the Elliott State Forest. So this place is very important to us. As you know, Oregon Wild does oppose the privatization or the auction option for the Elliott State Forest, so we are glad that DSL's report takes this option off the table for now. I'll reiterate that it really feels good to know that the public was listened to, given the overwhelming majority of folks who weighed in on the side of not selling off the Elliott. But we do have some concerns with the remaining options on the table. For example, options 1 and 2 still maintains the link between logging and school funding, and we do believe this concept is deeply flawed, as others have talked about, and it perpetuates the problems that we have facing the Elliott. The Evergreen Economic Report does find that it would be economically viable to take care of the Common School Fund needs without logging or without keeping the logging link to school funding. So we hope that you put options 1 and 2 aside for that reason. Another reason to put those options aside is because the Elliott would still be managed under the Oregon Forest Practices Act, which we feel is grossly inadequate to protect our streams and wildlife in this area. And most of the Coast Range is already heavily managed under the industrial forestry regime, and in order to get to the restoration that's needed for these streams and for our wildlife, we need to do better in management. The Siuslaw National Forest, which I mentioned, might be a logical entity to take over if you went the public transfer route. And that forest is consistently meeting or exceeding its timber targets through restoration, thinning, and getting a lot of other sort of associated stream and wildlife habitat restoration done with very little controversy, I don't think any controversy, and a lot of community support. So in conclusion, we really do look forward to working with you and the legislature and the other members of the Oregon Conservation Network in finding a path forward that can meet the Common School Trust obligation, but also protect our old native forests in the Elliott, do better at protecting these amazing coho salmon habitat streams, and look at some of the non-market values that I think were minimized a little bit in the economic report for future generations. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The next name I can't read, so I think it's Dan, and I think the organization is CFFW, and it might be Dahl, the last name. And another person would be Reed Wilson.
Welcome.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, indeed.
All right, I'm going to make a few points that I don't believe have been adequately addressed here.
Could you just state your name on the record?
Oh, yeah. My name is Daniel Prawl.
Thank you.
Okay, the first point I want to bring up is that the Earth is currently in a mass extinction event, and therefore any plan that prescribes the removal or clear cutting of native forests is completely inappropriate. The second point I want to make is in 1856, the Hani and Keech people of the lower Umpqua tribe, who lived with the land that became the Elliott, were forced into reservations where half of them were killed while their homes and lands were taken. And I believe that a significant tribal consultation could occur and should occur in the next phase, and the tribal transfer option should strongly be considered. The next point I want to bring up is the habitat conservation plan in the past have been ineffective in protecting endangered species like the spotted owl. The plan enacted in the early 90s killed over 40 spotted owls in only a couple of years. The next point I'd like to bring up is Ernie Nemeu's research, which was cited in the management report. It states that the Elliott could produce about $5,000 of revenue per acre from industrial timber management, but that the environmental cost would be somewhere between $50,000 to $300,000 a year in damage from climate change and endangered species lost in clean water. And next, I would like to bring your attention to the 2015 to 2017 Oregon Expenditure Report, which states that the timber industry has received over $300 million in tax breaks annually. I think a fair solution would be to reinstate the harvest privilege tax to pay for the buyout of the Elliott. And one of the earlier timber industry representatives came up and said that there's no timber in Oregon. There's actually over 1 million acres of board feed that are in backlog right now that they've chosen not to log. The governor has stated that climate change is the most imminent threat to our society, just recently at a rally in Portland. And how can clear-cutting any of the most productive carbon sinks in the world be appropriate given that fact? I have seen something spectacular in Oregon. I have seen it in the comforting grace of 300-year-old trees in East Hackey, in the stories, songs, and dances of the people, and in the public schools where I worked for 3 years with young adults and teachers from all over the world. But I have yet to see it in our politicians. I have yet to see the courage, the understanding, the willingness to act differently. Justice does not come easy, but it is needed, especially for the beings and places that cannot speak for themselves. It is those who work diligently for justice that create true freedom and will be remembered. Please listen to the overwhelming voice of Oregonians and not the corporate timber industry whom you all receive campaign contributions from. And Governor received $75,000 last year in the 3 days after this meeting. The state of Washington has successfully transferred their trust lands, and it can happen here in Oregon. The people who want to keep their forests make it happen.
My name is Reed Wilson. I'm a businessman. I want to thank the State Land Board for removing the privatization option, taking it off the table first. We've heard a lot of figures about money generated from timber harvest for state lands, and they're numbered in the millions. Okay, I want to say that that's an insignificant amount compared to the billions of dollars that can be generated for the state of Oregon by tourism, recreation, retirement income, and migratory influx. My business, I'm a jeweler. My business benefits directly from Oregon's beautiful scenery. On some days, every customer who comes into my store is from another country. Some of my customers have never in their lives experienced the kind of natural beauty that we see every day here in Oregon and take for granted. Some of my customers are retirees who moved to Oregon with a sense of adventure, and they speak of going for long hikes in the woods and photographing wildlife. Some customers are young couples who were educated in other states and moved back to Oregon because they miss the mountains, rivers, and forests. I have customers who return every year to vacation here and to spend income produced in other states. My point is, businesses all over the state of Oregon benefit from an influx of funds generated by the beauty of our scenery, and every clear cut in our forests detracts from that beauty. Tourism, recreation, and retirement income are growth industries. They have no upper limit. They continue to expand every decade, while extraction industries rely on a limited resource and are stagnant. In the future, continuing to subsidize the timber industry and allowing clear cuts to dominate our landscape will be the wrong direction for the growth of Oregon's economy. It's simply the wrong direction to take.
1 minute.
The economic health of my business and many businesses in Oregon stems directly from the quality of the environment, and there is a direct relationship between preserved public lands, especially lands with significant natural attributes like the Elliott State Forest with its old-growth forest and wildlife, and the economic growth of surrounding communities. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. The next person is David Ivan, and the last name begins with a P. I can't read it. And then Alice Williamson.
Morning, Governor.
Welcome.
Treasurer and State Secretary. My name is David Ivan Piccioni, and I'm a representative of, I represent myself as an environmentalist, and I want you to feel free to use some of my time to ask any questions if you don't understand something. Apparently, the message has not been communicated effectively because we're having these meetings every year. Either we're not explaining it right or you're not understanding it. Okay, there's the animal kingdom of which we are part. Humans are part of the animal kingdom, and then there's the plants. And without the plants, we can't live. I'm talking about humans and all the other species. The key process that makes this possible is called photosynthesis. And only plants can do it effectively. It can be done in a laboratory, but it does not produce the side effects of producing trees or fruits or vegetables or any other types of environment for plants, for other animals. So I just hope that you guys figure out that this is a long-term problem we're going to be having from now on. Like 200 years ago, there was 1 billion people on this planet. 100 years later, there was 1.5 billion. And now, 100 years later, there's 7 billion. So we're growing. More people are breathing air, which is necessary, and burning fossil fuels, which also produces carbon dioxide. The only thing that can turn that back is plants. Now, if you don't want to protect the forests, you got to think of something else. Your lawns are not going to cut it. Gardens are not going to cut it. So we need big, massive ecosystems that are mostly plant-based to sustain animal life.
Thank you.
And about the GMO bill, Monsanto Protection Act, that wasn't very good.
Thank you.
Governor Kitzhaber?
Yes, ma'am.
Can you guys hear me? Okay.
Yep.
Secretary Brown and Treasurer Wheeler. My name is Alice Williamson. I work with I work with U.S. Forest Capital. Thank you for accepting public comment today. U.S. Forest Capital is a Portland, Oregon-based company that assists communities in acquiring and managing working forest lands for the environmental, social, and economic benefits they provide. Since 2006, U.S. Forest Capital has helped to conserve 161,000 working forest acres valued at $245 million. Today, we would like to encourage the board to move forward with Scenario 3, request for proposals. This would allow Oregonians to propose management options for your consideration that best optimize the many attributes Oregonians want from the Elliott. We have submitted more detailed comments as part of the land board's process, but would like to offer for your consideration a community forest option that we have discussed with a number of community, industry, and conservation representatives. Here's how it would work.
Can you do it in 1 minute?
Thank you. A nonprofit community forestry group would be formed and would be made up of local and state environmental, timber, county, finance, and other experts. The Elliott would be transferred at market value to the community organization that would partner with an equity investor as required so they can make the state of Oregon and the Common School Fund financially whole. The nonprofit would work together to define how they were going to manage the Elliott for various timber, environmental, recreational, and social objectives. Because the organization would be a nonprofit, they would have more financial flexibility than a typical firm. However, because they will have financial and community commitments, they will also be required to continue harvesting trees. Our experience is that by bringing people together, there is a very high likelihood that they will be successful in agreeing on new forest management approaches that achieve a balance among different uses. Thank you for your time, and again, we would encourage the board to move forward with approving scenario 3.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Quick question. Was it Allison?
Alice.
Yes. Have there been, to your knowledge, conversations between timber and conservation interests regarding this scenario?
There have been, I would say, not formal conversations that have been organized by anybody, but I think it's an ongoing discussion.
Okay, thank you.
All right, we have 6 more people, David Harrison and Rana Foster. So if we don't have Rana Foster anymore, then we'll take Christy Splitt.
Good morning, Governor Kitzhaber, Secretary Brown, Treasurer Wheeler. My name is David Harrison. I'm Conservation Chair of the Salem Audubon Society, and on behalf of our membership, I'd like to urge you to protect the old-growth forests of the Elliott State Forest. You've heard this morning how the forest provides critical habitat for threatened marbled murrelet and northern spotted owl, and is also very important coho salmon habitat. The murrelets have been declining precipitously in recent years, even without destruction of their old-growth forest in the Elliott. Moving forward, it's critical that we decouple school funding from logging old-growth forests to end the conflict between the state's obligation to schools and conservation. This could be resolved by a buyout of the school trust funds as outlined in alternatives 3 and 4. I appreciate that the option to privatize the Elliott was taken off the table. Regardless what solution you come up with, I hope it will protect remaining trees over 100 years old and other natural values of the Elliott, such as wildlife habitat and clean water. I also hope it will encourage sustainable forestry and develop the recreational opportunities in the Elliott. Thank you for considering my input.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good morning, Secretary of State, Governor Kitzhaber, Treasurer Wheeler. For the record, my name is Christy Splitt. I work for the Oregon League of Conservation Voters, and I also represent and coordinate the Oregon Conservation Network. The Oregon Conservation Network is a coalition of 42 organizations across the state, from Brookings to LeGrand, that work together to promote and protect Oregon's natural legacy. Next month, you'll hear from our coalition that we've selected protecting the Elliott State Forest as one of our 2015 priorities for a healthy Oregon. That means collectively and by consensus, those 42 organizations have put protecting the Elliott at the tip top of our lengthy to-do list that we always have heading into a legislative session, or in this case, sort of a combination variety of branches of government involved situation. I also today am representing this giant stack of names. I bring to you today, I'll mail a copy of it to your land board assistants, 8,261 names affixed to a petition that I would like to read to you. Oregon Land Board, as an Oregonian who values our wild and natural landscapes, I urge the members of the State Land Board to protect the Elliott State Forest. First, please work to reform the illogical tie between logging on the Elliott and funding for schools. Oregon can do better than an arcane, outdated public policy that pits century trees, clean water, and endangered species against funding for public schools. All are vital to our state's future. Second, please protect the stands of century-old trees that serve as habitat for threatened wildlife and stand tall over clean waterways that provide drinking water and wild coho salmon. These old-growth trees capture and store vast amounts of carbon dioxide and are important tools in the fight against climate change. These stands and all of the Elliott ought to remain publicly owned. Third, I hope that you will consider how we can bring recreational interest to the Elliott, which contains no hiking trails or campgrounds for public enjoyment. The Elliott could one day be another coastal tourist destination, one for those wishing to get off the beaten path and see nature up close. Finally, with your leadership, we can have a win-win solution protecting the Elliott State Forest and its old growth, but also introducing restoration-based sustainable forestry on areas already affected by past logging. Science-based thinning can restore these forests to a more natural condition, provide better habitat for wildlife, and produce timber and jobs for rural communities. Thank you in advance for your leadership on this issue. We're really thrilled to see wholesale privatization already off the table for the work in the process of DSL. And again, I just want to say it one more time. That's 8,261 people have signed on to this. Thanks.
Thank you.
Just a quick question for Christy.
Yes.
Based on the 4 scenarios we've been discussing today and the 4 priorities you laid out, do you have a scenario that your organization networks would support or recommend?
Well, I have to admit I'm a new mom and I've been on maternity leave. I actually came in today just because this issue is so important, and I mean it. So our coalition has been having meetings reviewing the options, but I don't think we're ready to say publicly which one we would go for. I think we are open to sort of a hybrid approach, but I think primarily keeping it in public hands is a top priority, and any option that does that I think is one that would be far more interesting to us than any other.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can we have the last 3 people who are signed up come up, please? That would be Lynn Herring, Sam Sprague, and Claire Clock.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. She looked pretty rested. Welcome.
My name is Lynn Herring, and I'm here representing myself today. As a longtime conservationist, I might add, as stewards of Oregon state lands, you as the state land board must do all you can to preserve and protect the 93,000 acres of the Elliott State Forest, including the 41,000 acres of old-growth forest habitat. The Elliott, as well as the Tillamook and Clatsop State Forest, provide critical linkages with Oregon's federal forest in providing migration corridors and sanctuary for Oregon's wildlife, in particular imperiled species like the federally listed marbled murrelet, the northern spotted owl, and the coastal coho salmon. The state of Oregon Land Board should, and I'll summarize these and then say more. 1, maintain public ownership of the Elliott State Forest. 2, promote legislative action to decouple the Common School Fund from timber harvesting on the Elliott State Forest. A bit more on number 1, maintain public ownership. Selling off the forested lands on Elliott is an unacceptable solution to generate revenue for the Common School Fund. Private timber companies are not going to err on the side of ecosystem preservation to even implement selective thinning. They will only further fragment the forest by clear-cutting to accelerate growth of monocultural crops like Douglas fir for short-term timber harvest to the total detriment of ecosystem biodiversity with related habitat and species destruction. Most specifically, you should protect the 41,000 acres of old-growth forest to conserve the associated wildlife, their habitats, and pristine streams. 2, the decoupling from the Common School Fund from timber harvesting, help the local areas explore alternative funding strategies, encourage implementation of county and local taxes in general, but moreover promote taxes on local lodging and food service, provide recreational access to the Elliott. That in turn will encourage folks to spend time in this incredible area and again help generate much needed revenue. So please work with concerned individuals and groups that want to conserve and protect the biological diversity of the Elliott State Forest. And in closing, I speak in support of our state forest, wildlife, and habitat. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
My name's Sam Sprague. I want to thank you all for having me. I want to thank everybody that's talked so far for saying these things that we need to say. This is an important day. I want to thank you as well for taking off the total privatization. I hadn't heard that. That's good news. I'm the Cultural Committee Chairman of the Confederated Tribes of the Coos, Lower Siuslaw Indians. I speak for myself. I also speak for some of the tribal members that I know that agree with me. The Elliott State Forest is lower Umpqua land, Conus land from time immemorial, and we manage that land for future generations. You guys have a really tough job. You have to do the same thing, but you also have to pay for schools, and I understand that. There's a lot of different ways I think we could be paying for schools, and some of these other folks that are smarter than me have figured that out, I think. So there's a lot of things coming up as well, such as the passage of the marijuana legalization that I believe will help fund our schools. And I think that looking at the Elliott long term, we have to preserve what's there for future generations. I gather traditional materials to make cultural objects out of the Elliott State Forest. It's one of the only places that you can gather certain things. Old growth cedar for cedar bark, things like that are very important to our culture, our way of life. And we're trying to bring that back, but to take away the ecosystem that supports that would take away basically our culture and the ability of future generations to live like the old ones did and to honor them. And as you can tell, I'm really nervous. Trying to
doing a great job.
do my best to honor them by speaking to you today and asking you to look at this for the long term, to manage it for the long term so that future Oregonians can enjoy this place and so that there's a model of a place where we can say we live in Oregon, the best state in the United States. This is one of the best places in the best state in the United States, and I'm proud to say that. And I'd like to keep it that way. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary, Governor, Treasurer, for having this meeting today. I'm Claire Clockhorn, Corbett, Oregon. And as I was sitting here listening today, I marked up my comments, or down, or if you want to call it that, but a couple of points. I had thought that scenario 2 looked good, and some people might disagree with that, but I think the Department of Forestry is still in a get the cut out type of mode, and I think that can change. They have the skills, they have the background and the agency to do that. Although, listening to the testimony, Audubon Society, League of Women Voters, Conservation Voters also had real salient points and important ones. The use of scenario 2, of course, with the Department of Forestry would require a working group such as on the Siuslaw, on the Deschutes, Blue Mountain, Clackamas partnerships, forest partnerships that have occurred, so that could happen. Also, I attended the Pacific Logging Conference and show in Molalla this year, and the technology that goes into logging now, really, it depends on the operator whether they have the environmental damage or not. So I was really impressed with the type of technology that can do thinning and still not to impact the environment. And basically, the timber industry still has a cut and run operation type of management. And you can talk to the former residents of Kinzua or Valsets if you know where they are, and talk about unchecked logging and the quarterly model, financial model that the timber industry uses. And lastly, I'll put my actions where my words are, and I'll volunteer for any committee that might be able to do that. I have some skills that I've developed over the last 40 years in resource and conservation education. So
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. That concludes the testimony.
So, thoughts?
All right, I'll go first, Governor. First of all, I'm hearing, I won't call it a consensus, but I'll say I'm hearing a strong desire on the part of people who've testified today and previously that they would like us to seek a better balance between environmental, economic, recreation, and other potential uses of the Elliott State Forest and other forest lands. So I'm hearing that on one hand. On the other hand, that's running directly into the conflict that a number of people have mentioned in terms of our fiduciary obligation and our responsibilities as trustees. The Admissions Act speaks to benefiting the schools. The state constitution speaks to benefiting the public over the long term. The Attorney General's interpretation of how we demonstrate that fiduciary obligation is through maximizing revenues, and those things seem to be coming into conflict with the desire of many people in this room for us to do a better job of balancing. It's hard for us as a land board to be able to fulfill that balancing requirement because the state attorney general has made it clear that we must act within the best interests of our beneficiaries. And so I heard really good testimony today that, frankly, I agree with very strongly around sustainability values, around conservation, around water quality, around economic interests and jobs. But the reality is, as I interpret what I read in this report and the professional testimony we received previously, those, as you say, non-market values come into conflict with that fiduciary and trust responsibility. So that's sort of the first thing I'm hearing. The second thing I'm hearing, just as the state treasurer, is that the investment that we have in our common school portfolio, if I can refer to the Elliott State Forest as one asset in that portfolio, thinking of it as an investment, it's not consistent, I don't believe, either with the mission or the obligations of this board under trust law. We heard prior testimony before we opened this for public discussion around the low rates of return that we derive off of the Elliott State Forest, and we also heard that those returns are expected to remain low over the long term. So I see that as being a conflict. Furthermore, it's just not a good investment in a portfolio that should be diversified. It's administratively burdensome. I can't think of any other investment we hold in our state pension fund or any other one of our trust funds that requires as much administrative oversight and is as subject as forest lands to lawsuit risk. And there is no other investment in our state's $72 billion pension system that I stay up at night worrying whether or not it's going to burn down, except maybe a small portion of our real estate. So that's sort of the conundrum, if you will, that I feel like we as a board face. I did hear some good testimony on some potential ways out of the box. And I want to start by saying what I think the box is. I think the box that the three of us find ourselves in is a hopelessly antiquated model. I can't think of it. If we asked 100 people in this room, give us a governance model that helps us address these issues, which of you is going to suggest a governance model led by 3 elected officials who legally cannot communicate with each other on these issues? I wouldn't run a lemonade stand like that, much less try to run a complex forest investment like that. I personally am very encouraged by option number 3. I like the idea of holding the common school fund whole in terms of economic value and then being able to use those proceeds to invest in a modern, diversified, risk-managed portfolio without those administrative or litigation risks that we find with this particular asset. And I like the idea of finding a way to transfer the Elliott State Forest into a management or a governance structure whereby they can legally balance environmental and economic and recreation and other values without coming into conflict with the same obligations that we as the state land board come with as a result of the federal transfer in the Constitution and legal interpretation. So I would like to see further research conducted around option 3. I'm interested in the community forest model. I'm interested in the trust lands transfer model as they have in Washington State, and I believe also in New Zealand there's some good models there, and potentially in Australia that we should take a look at. I'd like to know more about the tribal transfer governor under option 4. I just don't know that much about it, and so I'd like to maybe learn a little more about that option. While I do trust our cohorts in the federal government, and we received a nice letter here from a couple of federal agencies, I do trust them. But it seems like for a long time the state has been trying to reduce federal management of forest lands in the state of Oregon. So I just think it would be odd for us to try and increase that, particularly knowing that the federal government has this real problem in even resourcing their own agencies. Somebody, I think, mentioned that in their testimony. That to me, I just don't like losing that kind of control over an asset to another government entity that I think is frankly a lot more dysfunctional than we are. So that seems like a step in the wrong direction, and unless somebody feels strongly about it, I would not like to pursue that. I think we could pursue an HCP under, was it scenario 2, where I think we could do that almost regardless of whatever else we do. I don't see why we couldn't do more than one thing simultaneously in that regard. But the bottom line for me is, we need to bring the governance model into the 21st century. What we have right now isn't working for anybody. So I'm really attracted to option 3. I think we should cast a broad net. We should ask that, U.S. Forest Capital Partners came in and gave testimony on one potential scenario. I'd like to learn what other scenarios and partnerships are potentially out there. And I don't think we should discount the possibility of the legislature creating an entirely separate state entity that is not the state land board, that reimburses us either through the bonding mechanism that somebody mentioned. And by the way, we don't have to do it at once. You could do it over a period of 20 or 30 years. But we could either do that or through limited sales, the proceeds could come back and reimburse it. And finally, Governor, and I'm sorry I'm long-winded, I've really been chewing on the comment around market value, because somebody made a great point when they were testifying. They said that the market value is defined by the highest bidder. And as you probably guessed, I'm really reluctant just to put a major state asset out to the highest bidder when it's a real estate asset that somebody else could potentially own. I don't want to sell the Elliott State Forest to a foreign national. I just don't. It's too integral to our state. It's a long-term asset, but the trust law may require us. So I agreed with the gentleman's point initially, and then I disagreed, because I actually don't think the way these federal laws and the state constitution and the attorney general's interpretation means the highest bidder today. I actually think it's something along the lines of net present value that we should be judging market value. And just to finish up, Chicago sold its parking meters to the highest bidder, and they thought that was the smart long-term economic decision to make. And those of you who've read about it, if you haven't, Google it, because it's an entertaining story, if nothing else. And it's sad. They sold an asset to the highest bidder, and with the benefit of long-term knowledge, they realized they made a terrible mistake, both economically and from the best interest of their city and their state. And so I think had they looked more at a net present value model, it would have made a lot more sense. Closing, thank you, Mary. Thank you, Department of State Lands. I'd like to thank the Department of Forestry. I know you've worked hard on it. I want to thank all the volunteers involved. I saw Tom Mimison from the Forestry Board here as well. People have worked really hard on this, and I'm glad that we had at least 5 people say that they think the process has been an honorable and a fair one, and I want to second that. So thank you. Those are my thoughts, Governor, in a nutshell.
Okay, like the young man who testified, that's a tough act to follow. But let me my thinking has changed, and I'm really grateful to have had the opportunity to kind of go through this process. And Mary, Paul, and Stephanie, and John, you guys have done just an outstanding job, and very grateful for your work, your time, and energy. I found a couple of things extremely compelling as I read the materials and reread the materials. For me, on page 38 and 39 of the Land Board report, the fact that the Land Board doesn't need to take a mechanical approach in consideration of economic factors in selecting an investment strategy, and that common school fund assets may be set aside for banking or conservation in the economic sense of the term, while their economic value appreciates, or for periods of time when no income would be affected by the designation. So for me, this language sort of reduced what I saw as pressure to make decisions and immediately, because I believe very strongly that we are making decisions over the next few months that will not just affect this next generation, but for many generations to come. So I'm not feeling like we need to make a decision tomorrow, and I think we can very thoughtfully move along this path. And I found these Attorney General opinions very compelling in terms of our ability to weigh decisions for the long term. The second piece, and several people have mentioned it regarding the coho and the amount of coho salmon that the Elliott Forest produced, for me was a particularly compelling fact. So given that, and so obviously many of the other issues, what I'd like to see us pursue more extensively is option number 3. I appreciated, I think it was Sam who was here from the Coos tribe. Is he still here? What I found most distressing is that we didn't have greater tribal representation, and I would hope moving forward that we would have very active conversations with the 3 confederated tribes that are in the Douglas and Coos County areas, Coquille, Coos, and Cow Creek. But I think we shouldn't preclude having conversations with the rest of the federally designated tribes in Oregon. I think there's an opportunity here for us to pursue these conversations. So I would certainly support moving down 3. That doesn't, in my mind, preclude any of the others, but I want to see more extensive due diligence around option number 3.
Very good. So I concur with that. I mean, I think no offense meant, Jim. I think the arrangement, the coupling, really makes absolutely no sense, and that's one of the reasons we're sort of tied in this. So I definitely would like to agree with the rest of the board about more due diligence on 3. I do think we ought to think a little bit about 1, simply because we haven't really clarified the sort of the trust law issue. I think, John, and I'd like actually legal counsel to take a hard look at the information that Mr. Charles and his colleagues brought forward, because that's, I think, something that we need to have a better sense of balance on. So I also have no problems, let me just add, and you can agree or disagree, in terms of pursuing an HCP. We spent 10 years doing that. And I mean, I don't actually see any light at the end of that tunnel. And if we were to pursue an HCP, I would want at time certain, when we actually had a pathway with NIMS, that we were going to get it. And I would say that would be 5 months, because that gives us the ability to get this other information. But other than that, if that's not realistic, and NIMS can let us know, I wouldn't want to pursue that. We spent a decade on that. So I don't know that we need a motion, but let me just give direction to Mary, and you can see if you comply with it. So really lean into option 3, the whole issue of how you address the decoupling issue, and obviously tribes should and can be involved in that. Do a little dip into option 1 and look at the whole question of trust law a little more thoroughly, so we have some answers to that. And then I'll talk to the National Marine Fisheries Service and call Mr. Stell and see if we can what we can work out on the HCP, if anything. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And then what we'll do is we'll flesh those out, and then we'll come back and hopefully engage many of you who want to be part of the solution, help craft the solution, and see if we can find something that will allow us to move forward.
Governor, may I ask just a logistics question? Does the Department of State Lands have the funding authority to conduct the research that we're asking for?
I believe we need an expenditure limitation, and I think we can work that out based on the directions we've just given the Land Board, and I'll speak to the legislative leadership about that.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Very good. All right. Well, thank you all for coming. Thanks for your input. And Mary, do you have anything else you want to say?
Yes, Governor. I just have a few.
You're twitching up there. I can see.
Yeah, I am. I'm twitching. So, I appreciate the direction, and that's sufficient for us to move forward. And I really appreciate the way that you've laid it out. I did want to actually take a few minutes to acknowledge some efforts that have gone on to bringing this together. And I want to start with a very broad acknowledgement. We would not be here today talking about old-growth forests and really great coastal coho habitat and marbled murrelet habitat and northern spotted owl habitat if we had not had the stewardship that the Oregon Department of Forestry has provided with its management of the Elliott over the years. So I want to start by acknowledging them. I also want to just acknowledge the members of the public. As you've seen both here today as well as in the meeting in Coos Bay, we have had an incredible participation on this project, and I really want to thank all of them. It's pretty rare, quite frankly, that you have opposite members of litigation sitting down at a table and really working productively together to try and find a solution. So I want to say thank you to all of the people that have participated for that. And finally, I do want to acknowledge our team from the department as well as the consultants. It's been a really intense 7 months, and we're happy that we're able to provide you with the information that was sufficient to give us some direction. So thank you to all those people who participated. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. If there is no further business, we stand adjourned.
I don't think it moves. No, and I think we were discussing it was able